blockchains. And we operate our wallet-based transfer agent system across all of those blockchains every single day. We've been doing so nonstop since 2022, and we have not had a single issue with the way that our system is operating. We are able to provide more accurate calculations to our clients, and we are able to provide more efficient reporting. We have lower costs on our funds from being able to eliminate intermediaries. We have more opportunities to expand the classes of assets that we're able to bring into the asset class and diversification pool by being able to take investments that today are investable but difficult to trade and put them into a tokenization wrapper that will allow them to become part of everyday investor portfolios. One of the chairman and one of the commissioners mentioned even IP, right, and other types of rights that can become things that people use in their own portfolios, their own home equity. We are really at a unique moment in time where we can create the opportunity because the technology is now there to allow us to. We look forward to working with the Commission, and we look forward to working with our peers to really help move us towards that new world.
I'm Johnny Reinsch. I'm the Executive Director of the Tokenized Asset Coalition. The Tokenized Asset Coalition is a member-funded nonprofit that consists of 60 or so members coming from all the leading protocols in the space, issuers, from every asset, from stablecoins all the way to things more esoteric like IP rights. Just want to say thanks to the Commission for hosting us here, and it's very encouraging to hear the words that we heard earlier from the various commissioners with the balance that they espoused in those words. So excitement, and hearing Commissioner Peirce say words like composability and interoperability, while the balance from the tone that Commissioner Crenshaw struck. I've been in the space since 2013, and if you told me that I'd be sitting on this panel today back then, I probably would have bought more. But just a moment of reflection for how far we've come, and it's a really, really exciting time. The reason why I was drawn to the space, and one thing I should say is views are my own, not the members. So if I go off piece, they can disclaim. But I started in 2013 when it was mostly just Bitcoin and a few others. And when Ethereum launched and the various technology around programmability started to be built, I started building in the space directly within tokenization. And I was drawn to it from the attributes of programmability, efficiency, transparency, and accessibility, fractionalization, allowing for lower minimums for people to get access to stuff. And a paradox kind of exists today in the market where the lowest risk assets, tokenized assets, stablecoins, and the most speculative assets are the only things that have access to DeFi in any meaningful way. And so there's an entire gap that I would love to see filled with thoughtful application, balanced application of regulation. I say that also with the recognition of having been in this space for over a decade and seeing us shoot ourselves in the foot multiple times and take too much risk on. And if you've been in crypto for as long as I have, a year in crypto is sort of like 10 years in a market, in a regular market. And I would like to see that balance come through in whatever we adopt. So one of my goals as the executive director of the Tokenized Asset Coalition is to provide some balance for our members that are, we all get very bullish. So the other thing that I would say is top of mind for me in my position at the TAC is global interoperability. Commissioner Peirce mentioned this in her remarks last week, but there's definitely this looming kind of silo or set of silos that could exist. And I think with various regulators adopting regulations across stablecoins and various other assets, I think the SEC is particularly in a great position to take a leadership role on how to regulate securities that are tokenized. And hopefully that can bring about some conversations with regulators globally about how to make this stuff interoperable. Looking forward to participating on this panel, and yeah, very excited to be here.
Hi, I'm Christine Moy from Apollo. Thank you for the Commission for inviting us and encouraging this discussion. We think the case for tokenization is rooted in its ability to fundamentally modernize how assets are created, distributed, and managed. We think tokenization brings automation and programmability to traditionally manual processes, streamlines operations and reduces costs across the investment lifecycle, and enables automated compliance. More significantly, it enables multi-asset interoperability, allowing different types of assets from private markets to public equities and fixed income to be represented, exchanged, and utilized together on a common infrastructure. So we think this unlocks new efficiencies and opportunities for both issuers and investors. At the same time, tokenization accelerates product innovation, giving institutions the flexibility to design and offer investment products that are more accessible and customizable, with the potential to broaden access to the diversification and investment benefits of private markets. So we see tokenization as just the next evolution of capital markets, merging the strength of the U.S. markets and our financial system with the programmability, composability, interoperability, and global reach of this digital technology. And I look forward to engaging with you all on this discussion.
My name is Robbie Mitchnick. I'm the head of digital assets at BlackRock, and I want to thank the Commission for hosting this event today, and also to acknowledge the staff with whom we've appreciated the engagement and earnest work over the last many months, and in many cases years on this topic. And also I hope that you'll accept my apology for my contribution to ruining Christmas of 2023 and New Year's of 2024 in the frenetic run-up to the Bitcoin ETP launches that next week. Our purpose at BlackRock is to help more people invest better, including democratizing access to investing by enabling more people to have access to investment opportunities in an efficient way. And we have a strong belief that tokenization and digital assets have a potentially very important role to play in that. Given I'm last on this opening, I won't repeat some of the many thoughtful and incisive points that my fellow panelists have made here, but rather I'll focus just on one specific tangible example to illustrate the potential of this technology. And that is in the context of the tokenized stable value yield fund that we issued as a firm in March of 2024 in concert with Securitize, who serves as our tokenization agent in that space. We think tokenization agent is a more suitable term here than transfer agent in this context. And what a stable value yield fund issued natively on a blockchain enables is the breaking of a long-standing trade-off that investors were forced to make between liquidity in terms of a cash asset that could be used in real time for settlement or payments, and access to full yield. In this case, we have seen the enablement of full U.S. Treasury yield through the tokenized yield fund, but through the properties of digital assets that make it possible to convert instantaneously into and out of stablecoins, which function as digital cash, that in effect the investor no longer makes that trade-off between yield and liquidity and has the real-time efficiency of both. Today, that's accessible just to institutional investors, but we are optimistic that in time that will become accessible to investors of all sizes and types, and also eventually that the benefits of tokenization, which many panelists have spoken to already, can be extended to additional asset classes as well. So we're very much looking forward to the discussion today.
Well, thanks for that, everybody. And Commissioner Crenshaw, you'll recall, and she raised a number of thoughtful questions. One of them is actually a great place to continue our discussion in terms of level set. She asked, what does tokenization mean? And so let's go through some of those basics. Alex, we'll start with you, and Johnny, maybe build on that, and we'll take it from there.
Maybe I'll just start here. I think the way and Commissioner Crenshaw laid out that there might be a myriad of definitions, but the way I'm looking at the tokenization, and welcome for feedback, is it really is just an evolution of dematerialization. So it allows for registered ownership and programmability, but it really is you owning the security. And so that is what tokenization is. And then it's powered by blockchains, right? And so blockchains are really just a virtual machine. And then in addition, there's this overlay of smart contracts, which can create additional functionality, which is that programmability, which is the buzzword that many have spoken about. And so I really think, and Commissioner Peirce alluded to, the smartphone makes you smarter. A new file format for your securities enables new functionality like better collateral or actual utility in owning your assets and securities. So that's really what I think of when I say tokenization. It's just a new file format. And then maybe just to fill out the picture, we started with certificated securities. That was the file format that was used and appreciated for a period of time. Those, as was alluded to, were kind of became less in vogue when there was additional optionality and the crisis of the paperwork crisis of the 1970s. And what happened was a great migration from certificates to immobilized securities. We think, and has been likely will play out, is tokenization is the new file format, which again allows for more programmability rather than just sitting on a centralized database. You can attach additional functionality and uses like compliance features and/or payment of dividends or corporate actions and the like.
Yeah, just to build on that, I can offer a framework that's potentially helpful. And we published this about 1.5 years ago called the Spectrum of Asset Tokenization. And if you think about the basic attributes of an asset that lives in the real world, you want to be able to prove that you own the asset, enforce legal rights, track the ledger of transfers. We do that traditionally on paper. In my prior existence as a lawyer, I did that a lot on paper. But then with tokenization, you move from that paradigm, and the first step is just a representation of all that off-chain activity on-chain. So you have a token and you have everything else that lives off-chain, living side by side. And then the spectrum goes up to fully enforceable on-chain native issuance with all legal enforcement on-chain as well. And that would be like a decentralized finance protocol, like a lending protocol, for instance. And then you can have flavors in between as well. So I agree with everything Alex said, and I think each asset might have a different flavor of tokenization to take into consideration. For instance, an intangible right could be easily natively issued, have all legal rights kind of attached to the contract itself, whereas physical gold can never be natively digitally issued. Only the token can be, but the gold will always have to live in the real world. So maybe that's helpful.
Thanks. And Christian, as we're thinking broadly in terms of basic level setting, prefatory points, anything else worth adding from your end?
Yeah, so I think we've had a helpful start to the discussion. One other way I think, or another analytical framework that's helpful is, particularly when we are talking about so-called real-world assets, which for many years have just been electronically represented. So we're moving sort of from electronic to digital here. Various litmus tests that basically tell you, to the points that Johnny and Alex raised, that you, at the end of the day, do have a legally enforceable ownership property right in the tokenized security. So, this is, I think, important in terms of thinking about if we tokenize an asset, what is the treatment of that asset? And for us at DTCC, this is always sort of like the question lurking in the background in a distressed market or a default scenario. In other words, if you do have a tokenized representation of an asset, is it going to walk and talk and swim and quack exactly like a security interest that you might have with an electronic or an immobilized asset today, or if you were to basically have an actual paper certificate or an otherwise transferable physical representation of the asset. So I think that's important to keep in mind. The other thing, which I'll defer to my colleagues who are more, I think, focused on the trading side, but in terms of issues around if the asset's tokenized, how does that asset act and trade or otherwise get utilized relative to the prior or the ongoing parallel existing asset? These are issues I think the Commission has thought about in other contexts in terms of dual share listings. Folks have alluded to the potential NMS considerations, an economically equivalent tokenized asset trading alongside a so-called traditional one. What does that do for capital formation and so forth? These, I think, are the more in the weeds questions that can be useful in really teasing out, if you say you have a tokenized asset, is it really a tokenized asset, or is it a derivative of the asset in tokenized format?
And just really quickly on that note, it does get really complicated when you try and keep both sets of records, so the on-chain book and the off-chain book. And I built a company, my last company in the space, specifically within private credit, and it was always trying to get to a digitally native issuance of something so that it was less of a less chance for failure, basically, when one ledger doesn't match the other one.
Una, Christine, anything you want to add?
Sure. I think it all starts with taxonomy. We view it as sort of the foundational underpinning in terms of how digital assets and tokenization can be integrated into the existing system. And when you think about the investor choice, investor best interests, and investor protections as our North Star, and start with that, having a clear and predictable taxonomy will help us to understand how best to adjust the rules and regulations to make sure that the new innovation fits into the space. And we've been able to do that in the past with different, not just with innovations in technology, but also innovations in products and processes as well. So, we've submitted a letter on taxonomy and other questions that were raised in Commissioner Peirce's February statement, and we have certain categorizations of it. But for today's discussion, I think it's important to think about financial security and whether distinctive sort of characteristics should be laid out from within the financial securities category. And to paraphrase Commissioner Peirce's statement is in that, digital representation of a security or issuing a stock on a digital ledger does not change the substance of that security. And I think that's a very important basic premise to start with, because then we can figure out what the rules of the road are with respect to how we then fit that into the existing rules and regulations, and also think about how to calibrate and adjust and update the rules based on that distinction. And then going down even further, I think there is a distinctive sort of characteristics with respect to private securities and public securities in particular. To point out the obvious, obviously there are disclosure requirement differences with respect to private and company issuers, but also there are different rights, privileges, and obligations of the shareholders as well. And over time, of course, there's been additional mechanisms and listing standards and other things that have been built, all to serve the investors in terms of providing reliable access, best price, best kind of environment for them to trade in. So, we should think about that in that context, and we should think about it in terms of, different mechanisms that have developed over time, whether it be trading and market real-time surveillance, whether it is notification with respect to corporate actions, not just because speed is lacking, but just so that there is orderly dissemination of material news to the public markets. There are things to think about in terms of trade halt mechanisms, both for volatility and for regulatory considerations as well. And then there's, of course, adjudication and reasons why certain trades are broken due to errors and other issues. So when you sort of think about that in the context of facilitating capital formation with clear rules of the road for issuers, investors, and market participants, then we can start out with a very clear, predictable taxonomy, and then expand our discussions from then on.
And just to build upon my fellow panelists' comments, I think the main thing for us to note in this discussion is that tokenized securities should not be confused with bare digital assets. I think we take that for granted, but worth noting, because tokenized securities we think of as permissioned compliant assets with embedded smart contracts to enforce transfer restrictions, legal constraints, and regulatory rules like AML, KYC, investor status, jurisdiction, et cetera. Despite being permissioned and compliant assets, we think about them in the context of operating on secure and sound, permissionless public blockchain infrastructure. A lot of lingo there, so certainly taxonomy is very important. But the main concept is having compliant securities on public infrastructure with the right controls codified in. And then, building further on, kind of interoperability, I think the really interesting thing that we don't spend enough time thinking about is that, we really have an opportunity, to Sandy's point, to think about how we, kind of enable the best investments for the most people, as Robbie stated in his mission. The idea that tokenization, regardless of where it comes from, regardless of if you're a native tokenization or if you're, an asset in custody that's being tokenized or everything in between, is that you're actually what you're actually doing is bringing all of these different assets together, as I mentioned, from private markets to public equities and fixed income, onto the same operating system, and enabling programmability and composability across those, which then enables us to build comprehensive, holistic portfolios that can be customized to a broader range of investors for their desires, right? So, it's important to understand the mechanics of how we tokenize and the different nuances of the different ways we tokenize, but the net output is that we can have more assets together on the same operating system to build better investment products for the future.
Well, thanks. And just to pause for a second, taxonomy, other introductory points around the mechanics, et cetera, just pausing to see if anybody has any other points they want to make or react to anything anybody said.
Just maybe raise a question on, because we use the term interoperable a lot. I think it has a number of meanings. When I use the word interoperable, I mean tokenized securities interoperable with their book entry version that's held, in the TradFi sense. But I think there's another layer of interoperability where we're talking about, there's a myriad of blockchains, Solana, Ethereum, et cetera, and interoperability between those. I think it probably means all of the above, but I think both of those are important to be mindful of when we're thinking of and discussing interoperable. But I don't know if there's other points there.
Just want to add back the regulatory interoperability is important too. Because even if you can technically move across chains, doesn't mean you can actually do anything with it on the other chain.
Sandy, we'll turn to you in a second. Regulatory operability, anyone want to chime in? Any other thoughts on that specific point? Christian?
Yeah, so there's different layers there, I think. One layer that I think everyone's very sensitized to, and I know this organization and related organizations are working on, is just across the diversified regulatory framework we have in the United States between securities products, non-securities products, capital market activity, prudential activity. The other layers, though, I think are a bit more nuanced. It goes back, I think, again, to this question of whatever taxonomy you come up with, you need to make sure that that taxonomy, I think, takes into account and respects other legal regimes that interact with our markets. So take collateral, for example. If we want to unlock the potential for tokenized assets to serve as a collateral optimizing force, we have to make sure that the underlying And in this case, it's usually state commercial law regimes. The Uniform Commercial Code comes up, and we can have a discussion about Article 8 and Article 12 if folks want. But generally, you need to make sure that's compatible. I kind of take the point from what Johnny's saying. You can move it from one chain to the other, but if I can't perfect my security interest in the tokenized collateral on the other chain, it's not really going to do very much for me. So I think those are factors to keep in mind as you're coming up with the taxonomy to make sure they speak to that broader ecosystem. The existing framework has done that very well up to this point, so I'm not, I think, suggesting a new problem or even a problem per se. It's just a consideration that I think will take the potential very far forward.
Sandy?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes these conversations, even for me who understands everything everyone's saying up here, get a little complicated. So I just wanted to go back to the absolute basics of it. A token is a wrapper, as someone said here. It's a new file format. But what is unique is that you can embed the contract that governs the regulation and governs the use and governs the transferability and governs the legal protections of that asset right in the asset. And the ledger that you record the transaction on can read and administer all of those terms that are in the contract that is embedded into the asset. And so if you think about today, there are hundreds of contracts that people need to have in place to be able to trade securities. And those contracts have to be reconciled back to the asset itself. And there are dozens and dozens and dozens of teams in every organization whose entire job is to reconcile back and forth between these contracts that govern the use and all those other aspects of the asset that I discussed and the asset. And the big innovation here, the big opportunity here is that we can now embed those contracts into those assets, and we can use the power of these calculation utilities to make sure that these assets can be properly administered without as many manual interventions and without as many problems that can potentially come from all of the problems that come with people trying to do things and move between documents and other systems. And so it really is a huge enhancement beyond just being a new wrapper, right? It really is a way to make the system work more automatically and more effectively.
Robbie, let's go to you and let's transition now thinking about the concrete opportunities, what's working well, where are there gaps, both in terms of thinking about the infrastructure and the legal and regulatory regime. Talk to us in terms of what you're seeing at BlackRock in terms of the existing infrastructure out there and opportunities, challenges, et cetera.
Sure, Jeff. Well, certainly there are many parts of our existing market infrastructure that work quite well today, right? And I think that in some respects, some of the slow-ish progress that has been made in terms of tokenization adoption to date, while some of it may be related to regulatory clarity that is now trying to be addressed, some of it is a function of the fact that if the existing market infrastructure works pretty well, there's a high hurdle to migrating to a new technology standard, even if there's a recognition that that new technology standard is an improvement over the existing paradigm. But there are certainly areas where we believe there have been significant step change improvements enabled by tokenization that give strong conviction in the merits of making that migration. And one such example where we're seeing early benefits realized, but there's potential to do so at a much greater scale, is in the context of collateral, where tokenization makes it possible to pledge, to rehypothecate, to have transparency into, to liquidate in near real time various forms of collateral instruments. And if you take one example today where the existing infrastructure and regulatory regime is not really in a position to support this. It's in the usage, for example, of money market funds as collateral, where the existing paradigm makes that difficult to do at scale. But when you think about tokenization, we have the opportunity to migrate from a world where to actually post a money market fund as collateral, you first have to liquidate it, deliver cash, and then instruct reinvestment into a money market fund, which is obviously a very inefficient and friction-filled system, which can also add sell pressure in times of market stress into the underlying funds and their underlying collateral. And now, with this new technology paradigm, there's an opportunity to do this through a direct, nearly real-time pledge that's transparent and enables instant liquidity on a secondary basis into, for example, stablecoins as digital cash instruments. And that has wide-reaching potential implications across many areas where collateral is a critical part of our financial infrastructure, including derivatives, repo, and securities lending.
Sandy, over to you.
If I could add to what Robbie said, because I 100% agree with the points that he made, take it even one step further, right? If we tokenize the underlying securities that sit in the government money market fund, and we come up against another 2008 type event where there is uncertainty about who is going to be able to access that underlying collateral. I mean, don't forget, this tied up some of the lawsuits around Lehman Brothers for 2 or 3 years to be able to figure out who owned the underlying collateral. If we could immediately move from the tokenized money market fund and into the tokenized assets that sit within that fund, we can immediately get the collateral and begin to unwind all of the obligations in the marketplace, right? So this is another improvement where, you know, having these off-chain assets and these contracts that govern it constantly make us go back in periods of stress and try and figure out how can we accelerate the return of collateral, how can we accelerate the unwinding of positions. And tokenization can give us far superior answers to those problems, and ones that move at the speed of the market so that there would be less stress in the market, because you can have immediate dissolution of a fund and immediate distribution of its underlying assets, right? So these are points that often get overlooked in why today's systems don't work very well. And this is someplace I think that we would see massive enhancements if we were to move in this direction on a broader basis.
Johnny?
Yeah, I just want to add, there's a really great example of what Sandy just mentioned at work during one of the biggest crypto market shocks of the entire time I've been in crypto. Terra Luna was a synthetic stablecoin that crashed, and I'll make no judgment about how it was built, but in decentralized finance, which housed a bunch of loan transactions by smart contract, collateral was sold and liquidated, and lenders were repaid pursuant to the terms of the smart contract, even though there was a massive amount of volume that hit the system at that time. Everybody got repaid, and everything worked the way that it was supposed to. So we've seen time and time again that what Sandy is describing works really well and in real time.
Una?
Yep, so I think we all kind of share the goal of fungibility, interoperability as a achievement that we want to have with respect to tokenization. And I think what's also important to remember is that that probably is going to require methodical peeling of the onion in terms of how we get there, because we all want to try to get to that place. So, you know, when you think about sort of what we have now, there are aspects of the system that are resilient and robust and really provides a great opportunity for investors to make decisions, even when there is unexpected news like we had on April 7th, in terms of being able to make financial decisions in a very quick way. So I think the big, question mark is how can we preserve the benefits of those mechanics and market characteristics, and then apply it and integrate this new technology into the system in a seamless way for wider adoption. And when you think about it from a sort of a legal framework, of course, we have the state laws, both in terms of the corporate statutes and commercial statutes. And I think while some of the jurisdictions like Delaware and Texas have adopted blockchain technology as part of their and allows corporations to adopt that technology for stock ledgers and corporate records, there's still probably room in terms of additional work to be done in terms of making sure that that is available to the corporations. And then when you're looking at the securities laws, separate and apart from just offering registrations under the 33 Act, there's a bit of work to be done with respect to the 34 Act in terms of the registration of a security under the Exchange Act and what that means and what the thresholds and triggers and the privileges and the obligations of being a 34 Act security really means, not just for the issuers, but also for the investors as well. And then, there are sort of ancillary, but just as important things to think through in terms of how that also interplays with regulatory regime under NESMIA and cover securities and the blue sky laws. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. And so I think we have a little bit of work to do with the staff at the SEC, and I think we're all ready to roll up our sleeves and think through those matters. But I do want to end with an opportunity to just build on what Robbie said about collateral management. I think there's a real opportunity here to ease congestion with respect to proxy plumbing and processes. When you think about tokenization or DLT technology in particular, there may be ways to track security ownership in a way to get rid of the 20 business day broker search rule, which already seems a bit obsolete given the T+1 settlement cycle, as well as the special dispensation that is being given to special meetings. There may also be a way to address the gap between issuers and objecting beneficial owners without giving up on the privacy rights of the holders, and also addressing broker-dealer considerations as well. And then, of course, there are real opportunities for dissemination of information, proxy materials to the investors in a quicker way, cheaper way, as well as thinking about how blockchain technology can be used to tabulate votes, audit them, and have real-time information. So I think those are really interesting and exciting ways to think about tokenization and DLT in particular.
Alex?
I just want to touch upon, collateral and proxies are fantastic use cases. I also would be remiss not to highlight that the technology also can enable, fantastic lending of your actual securities, and then additionally, exchange that can happen in a much more economic way. So, lending right now, you're subject to your broker, and that's the only person you can really utilize for a borrowing venue. But within crypto that exists right now, the founder of Superstates, Robert Leshner, he created Compound, which is one of the first DeFi lending protocols and has done billions and billions of dollars of lending, but has only utilized crypto assets. To the extent that more real-world assets and securities move on-chain, those types of primitives can and should exist. Similarly, market makers have been printing money by creating price improvement, and maybe we can touch upon Reg NMS later on. But at the end of the day, a system of trade doesn't, and maybe we take a step back. 1975 amendments, they didn't envision one central limit order book as a national market system, right? They envisioned a subsystem and various other integrated systems that work together as being a national market system. If they had envisioned one central limit order book, we wouldn't have a myriad of exchanges, and we wouldn't have the advancements of the early 2000s into the ATS world, and we wouldn't have where we're sitting right now, where there's the ability for decentralized exchanges to allow for peer-to-peer interaction and the ability for you actually to directly earn some return from providing liquidity. And so I think obviously low-hanging fruit is collateral. Low-hanging fruit is peer-to-peer in a direct manner. But additionally, enhanced through a protocol, there's an ability to do a lot more and different things. And so I think that is, we would be remiss if we don't touch upon that in the benefits of tokenization.
Cynthia?
So you actually said something that really strikes me as an important point. We talk a lot about the technology, but what you just talked about financial primitives. And so, a point that we talk a lot about is finance is still finance. At the end of all of the conversations around the technicalities of the things that this technology can do, and what this technology and moving assets on-chain to be able to be loaned or used as collateral in a pool that it enables a wider range of access to capital. So this is really, at the end of the day, about facilitating more efficient capital flows by creating these new structures that will, create more direct access for individuals to use their assets in ways that today are limited by the intermediaries, with which they are, currently engaged. And that, we think of as tremendously an improvement for access to investments and capital.
No, Sandy?
I just wanted to also bring out one other, I think, very important use case that we are seeing in real time, which is the way that we calculate what we owe shareholders today is really based on the next morning's shareholder record, right? Because we need this time to reconcile the shareholder record, we need this time to record the shareholders. And so when we award interest on a fund or dividends or corporate actions on a fund, we're awarding that the next day. And in the case of money market funds, we accumulate those awards over the period of a month and we pay them out monthly, right? This is a very inefficient way of doing this because we have built our blockchain transfer agent on blockchain and we are settling every single transaction as it occurs. We are able to calculate our shareholder record in real time, and we're able to break our shareholder record out by increments of the day. We've chosen to use 1 second increments. So, for corporate treasurers who come in and they put money into a money market fund in the morning, but they've needed to pull that because there were unexpected expenses that they needed to cover later in the day, right? They are unable to get any of the interest for that period of the day that they held the money market fund because at the close they were not a shareholder of record. With the new way that we're doing this via smart contracts and tokenization, we're able to create an exact record. So if that corporate treasurer held that money market fund for 4 hours, 32 minutes, and 17 seconds of the trading day, they would get 4 hours, 32 minutes, and 17 seconds of the interest, and we pay it out every single day in incremental new issuance of the token, including Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays, right? This is a huge improvement in the way that the market works, and this would be available to all investors who held tokenized funds. It is something that is not available today, especially when you think about long weekends, right? If you purchase a money market fund on a Thursday, that doesn't really get settled until the following Monday if it's a 3-day weekend, or the following Tuesday if you pick it on a Friday and Monday's a holiday. These are all inefficiencies that we just all live with in today's system that we do not need to live with going forward.
Well, we keep touching on it, and let's now drill down a little bit in terms of regulation. It went through a couple different threads here. And Christine, I'll start with you, then maybe go to Christian. As you're looking at the landscape for regulation, what's good, what's working well, and what are impediments out there for the commission to think about?
Sure. We think one of the most compelling regulatory opportunities in this context of tokenization is the modernization of the transfer agent rules. as we mentioned earlier with tokenized securities, like the core compliance functions like KYC and AML and jurisdictional limits, investor accreditation, can be embedded directly into the smart contracts and automated. So what that means is that, essentially smart contracts are doing the transferring. But we think that there still requires a regulatory layer. I think you said it well when you said digital transfer agent or tokenization agent, is basically a function for this new infrastructure that can help manage edge cases like wallet recovery or freezes, sanctions compliance, and complex corporate action. So we think that there's a real opportunity to, enhance that definition. We also think that permissionless public blockchain should be recognized as official record of ownership. I think there was mention about duplicative record keeping that's required. And so being able to clarify that specifically would eliminate the duplicative off-chain record keeping, streamline operations, and unlock the efficiencies that tokenization in digital assets has promised. Another key area that we think about often in tokenized securities is the three-step process. We think that, as I mentioned earlier at the beginning, tokenized securities are neither crypto commodities nor bearer assets, and have the smart contracts with the embedded transfer restrictions, so should meet the 15C3 possession and control requirements. And so we think assets should be eligible to be custodied and traded by broker-dealers without triggering the three-step process. Additionally, self-custody, I think this was kind of mentioned in opening comments, self-custody should be an investor choice, should be permitted when chosen by the investor. It enables direct access to innovation, reduces intermediary fees, and supports user control without compromising regulatory oversight. And then, when it comes to settlement, we think blockchains offer, great automation and transparency. And so we think tokenized securities can and should be settled using stablecoins, just as cash is used in traditional finance, without imposing extra regulatory burdens, simply because the payment rails are digital. So those are just like some of the areas that at least us tokenization nerds spend a lot of time thinking about.
Christian, anything?
Yeah, so that was a pretty thorough list, but I think what I think I would add to it, and I think this kind of, I'm going to go back. I know it feels like we've kind of beaten it a little bit too much, but the interoperability point. So a lot of the potential efficiencies that have been highlighted by folks on the panel are all great and well, I think, in sort of unique sort of environments where you have a universe of actors or parties who can perfectly kind of control what the environment is, particularly in terms of like, as Alex alluded to, like there's different sorts of chains technologies out there. There's different sorts of programming languages. So if folks are making those choices on sort of a disparate basis, you have to worry about like the issue of fragmentation, and something that the, I think, current regulatory approach over the years has done a really good job of is dealing with like market liquidity. So we don't want to kind of go back or create like a new set of problems where if we allow, 1,000 tokenized ecosystems to bloom, they can't interact and interoperate with each other really well. Now, I'm only familiar with one context where the Commission attempted to try to address interoperability, and it was in the very narrow area of central matching. But I think it's fair to say that's not really an area where a regulator sort of prescribing how interoperability is going to work did very well, because I speak as someone at DTCC. There's only one central matching service today. But I think if you look to basically really unlock the potential of this and scale it to the level of a national market system or a national clearance and settlement system, outside of just reducing inefficiencies within specific asset classes or regulatory ecosystems, you really need to think about how do we ensure that the market is dynamic enough that if I have my assets on one chain and Una has her assets on the other chain and we want to interact with each other, it doesn't matter that the chains are different, that they have different protocols, that that basically for us it's just as seamless as all the benefits everyone's been describing. So that's one thing. The other thing I would bring up, and this is kind of a mixed bag, because on the one hand, a lot of regulation, particularly I would say in the Exchange Act world for market intermediaries like ourselves, is that on paper, we have a lot of flexibility to adopt reasonably designed policies and procedures to take care of topic X, Y, Z. Well, in the technology space, that's not always as flexible as you would think, particularly with new and emergent technologies. So, and I'm not even thinking of ledgers. There's other technologies that have come up over time, AI, cloud, all sorts of things, right? And there's obviously a very legitimate concern, which I think will persist in the future, about resiliency, about availability, about safety. I say this as someone who took the train from northern New Jersey today as opposed to other options. And so effectively, I think what we need to think about, I've seen it in the public comment file, you take regulation SCI, seems like very strong medicine for trying to sort of get something off the ground. But some sort of directional guidance or clarity around how market participants are going to start using these new technologies in a way that on the one hand supports market resilience, liquidity, and the great public good we have of the U.S. financial markets, versus something that is not too overly prescriptive, I think is something that's needed, because it's just been very, very challenging, I would say, to really at scale try to implement these new technologies to really get you to some of the places that folks on this panel have been very persuasively describing.
Christian, I have a question on the follow-on and for the panel. I agree and think about the interoperability challenges the same way. Can we get best price in the market at high speed, high capacity in the way that we would with traditional securities today to benefit our end investors? Who should determine or unlock the interoperability challenges? That's something that we think we should ask of the commission, or is that something that we as an industry should coalesce around, a la the fixed network and what we've seen there?
Yeah, so I lean more towards it should be people on this panel and people in this room. I think what I am suggesting is, though, that probably what would be useful is for the commission to consider laying out some high-level guideposts or considerations, like what are the things that interoperability should accomplish? What are things that are considered to be at odds with interoperability, so that at least we have, it's kind of like another taxonomy point, we have a common set of principles that we can use to dialogue with each other about what interoperability looks like.
I also think there's a disclosure point in there too, Christian. So as an issuer of a tokenized asset, if you're trying to design risk factors, you should probably take into account the network that you're issuing on and make sure that the risks of that network are clear to the people that are purchasing your security.
But there are available answers to these issues that are being brought up. I mean, we operate across 9 different blockchains, 4 different programming languages across those 9 different blockchains. We, as the transfer agent, have built a wallet-based system that is able to internalize any transfers across blockchains. We have an allocation system that really evaluates the characteristics of each blockchain to see if it meets certain standards. And we have gone back to some of these blockchains in looking to explore and deploy on them, and made them enhance certain of their security characteristics to be able to feel that they are a sufficient location where we have trust in the technology that it will operate as expected. So, we're solving these issues in real time at our firm, and I think a lot of our learnings could be very quickly adapted across the industry. The one other point I'd add, I think, is that it got a little glossed over, but I think it's critical. There are some new models. There are some automated market-making models. We hear so much about all the applications of agentive AI, and how people are deploying AI into their investment processes, and everyone seems to think this is a great idea. And yet we have these new pooled investment opportunities where any participant can join in a liquidity pool, and we seem to be ignoring the opportunity there to get over some of the fragmentation that we have in the marketplace today by letting people join liquidity pools and benefit by adding liquidity into the pools. And so I think that we also need to go back to my very early this should come back in the end to not just how do we protect the consumer, but how do we create opportunities for the consumer. And this is one where there is a tremendous opportunity to let them into models that have only been preserved for the most niche of financial players in the past. And I think one of our responsibilities as an industry is to think about how to really create that more equal playing field.
Just to answer Will's question, I think it's also important to think about corporate issuers' perspectives here as well. We should think about how many of them who do not really interact on a daily basis with the financial ecosystem, other than for the fact that they have registered public securities and that they trade, they're going to want to have clear, rules of the road, not just for themselves, but for the intermediaries and for the market participants and for those who are supporting the market. So just going back to everybody's sort of comments about vertical sort of silos and a potential for regulatory arbitrage with different sets of rules, I think we need to just make sure that there are clear sets of rules, treat like assets alike, treat similarly situated market participants in the same way. And that's going to give comfort to the corporate issuers who are going to be part of this new technology, who are going to have to be the consumers of the new technology as well. And I think that's going to help us sort of think about wider exception if we're able to have standardized sort of practices and rules and regulations.
Question for Will. Thinking about calibrating regulatory requirements. If we think about a tokenized NMS stock, should regulatory obligations and requirements change? Should they be modified? Talk about that.
Well, our view would be that the regulatory requirements for an NMS stock should not change just because the product chassis has been changed or the security chassis has been changed. We do think we have a strong regulatory framework to build off of. It's not perfect, but I think the foundation's there. And through regulatory innovation, I think we can adjust for some of the things that we've talked about. One of them was the interoperability discussion that Christian just teed up, and so we won't go back into that. We have talked about coexistence, where we have a TradFi listing of a security sitting side by side, a digital security, and having that under a common regulatory framework, I think is fundamental to having a continuous market where natural arbitrage mechanisms can come into play and make sure that end investors are getting the best price in the market. I do think there's also this sort of issue of who can tokenize a security, or from an issuer perspective, who can tokenize a fund, an ETF, or a security that's been listed. And we have seen instances of that more, I'll say on a global basis, that it's been a challenge, as to what that means. So bringing it into an NMS framework, into a regulatory framework, I think will put to bed some of the risk issues that we see in there, where credit could become a problem, where a platform and protocol, is an underlying credit exposure to the participants on that, and then the accessibility issues that we talked about before, and understand the price consequence of being able to interface with those at high speed. So those are some of the big things that we think about.
Una, anything to add on that one?
No, I agree with what Will has said, and I've sort of touched on that in terms of sort of the current practices that we already have that gives predictability to the investors and corporate issuers and other market participants as well. So I think it's really important for us to just think about all of those benefits and just put it into the context of the existing system, and just putting it into the context of some of the numbers, especially given that we've seen some record volume in the month of April, and I know we had a busy day earlier today as well. So, NASDAQ alone during the week of April 7th traded $1.2 trillion. And just on the 7th alone, there were probably, more than 900 million messages within a given minute. So when you think about sort of the volume and the traffic that is involved in the current system, we just want to make sure that we're very thoughtful in terms of how to provide those benefits to all the participants as we move forward.
Let's talk for a moment. Oh,
Yeah,
Alex?
could I just hop in? So I think I agree with what Will was saying with regard to Reg NMS, but I think when you're looking at these securities, one that exists on-chain and one that exists in the traditional database, I think there's a clear regulatory out with regards to the on-chain securities because they would not be, and when we talk about NMS, most likely we're talking about 611 and trade through protections, and how would that exist on-chain? I think the way that exists on-chain is these aren't trading in a regular way, and so these can trade in a different way, and therefore that restriction should not apply. Similarly, when we're looking at best execution, like when does that attach itself, right? That attaches itself when a broker is involved in a transaction, and so if this is something that an individual is doing, there's a different standard that's being held and should be accounted for there. Furthermore, best execution is not best price, right? And so there's a whole myriad of things that can go involved in that. And furthermore, like this different structure can coexist and interoperate. But when we're looking at things, and I think this, if you go back, there really is an issuer and there's an investor with capital. And how they operate and interact with each other from there is, all a construct, right? And so we can really be, as we shape what is necessary and required, what we should do is we should look at the risks that are attendant, not just what has been done previously. And so if there isn't a risk of fraud or misappropriation or various other things that are involved there, those shouldn't attach, right? Similarly, if there is technical risk or harms that could be present, there should be, as was alluded to, generalized standards that are held and maintained to ensure that just because something is on-chain, there isn't a regulatory arbitrage. There's just a different approach because it's in a different setting, similar to how NMS applies to what we have considered, traditional finance. On-chain finance unlocks completely new opportunities and restrictions and regulations that should apply, such as, code audits and resiliency tests and various things like that. But the other thing is you don't necessarily need an intermediary, right? Like on-chain activity that is governed through autonomous code does not have an intermediary. And so when I go back to there's an issuer and there's an investor with capital, the issuer is involved in running a business. They typically, and has been alluded to often, enlist a third party, like a transfer agent, to handle the record of ownership. And maybe a better term for this transfer agent or this improved intermediary is this tokenization agent, where they can control and ensure that the standards that we collectively agree to that should be held on-chain are maintained. So I think that's how you get to this interoperability and you unlock new use cases without introducing additional risks.
Will, I want to make sure I get to you on the following question. Commissioner Peirce, in her request for comment, she raised 40 Act issues, and in particular, whether tokenization of redeemable registered investment company securities, whether there's any unique issues to discuss there. What do you think?
Yeah, well, since 1940, the Investment Company Act has really endured in large part because of the Commission's ability to use their tools in rulemaking, exemptive relief and no action relief to adjust for innovations in the market, albeit technical or market driven. And here, again, we think they could use those same tools to help affect changes that we'd call out across a couple of different points. One of those is a topic that we've already hit about the single book of record. I think that is something at a transfer agency level that could bring efficiency to all of our operations, and we've hit on that pretty hard. The second is around the investment company's access first disclosure requirements for investor communication documents like prospectuses and shareholder reports. Again, I think there are efficiency gains from using this technology to tackle that, but it would require some form of relief. And lastly, I think it's kind of bridging into a more complicated topic of the dual share class, where the commission is currently working through, I think more than 50 different filings there. And that topic does lend itself to this issue of would we see a mutual fund, ultimately become tokenizable as well? In there, we would have the 2A7 money market funds. We think these funds can perform a very valuable function in the ecology of our workflows. And if they do evolve into the ability to trade 24/7, which we've also talked about, then there is an implication of the forward pricing rule under the Investment Company Act of 22C-1 that I think would have to be under consideration. Those are a couple of different topics that we would bring up.
Others on the 40 Act?
Yeah, that's where having automated market makers that are able to create real-time pricing could come into play as a very effective way of
permitted.
evolving
Yeah.
the system. I think that the other thing to realize with the 40 Act fund is that, the mutual fund structure itself has many inherent tax inefficiencies, that we are already seeing a pretty significant migration of money out of the 40 Act mutual fund structure into actively managed ETFs, because the ETFs have better ability to give that flexibility to manage the tax basis on the fund. And it has the create redeem ability that gives more flexibility on how to actually trade the portfolios. I think that if you look at where we could go with tokenization, it would really be an evolution on the ETF structure itself, because in a sense, the ETF structure is like a token that is wrapping all of these different securities inside of it, and we can unwrap, burn, or we can mint, create those tokens. In the ETF share classes today, it's a very apt analogy to think about how a tokenized mutual fund or a tokenized ETF might work, where the token becomes that instrument that's programmable that gives us better functionality for administering and maybe taking away some of the tax disadvantages of the mutual fund 40 Act structure. So I think that, it's 2025, something that has served us well for 85 years, definitely, and has evolved, to Will's point, definitely deserves to be able to continue to evolve. And that might mean changing the way we think about how some aspects of these 40 Act mutual funds operate.
Cynthia?
So absolutely agree with everything that Sandy just said about the innovations and the opportunities for traditional mutual funds. Having been in this industry at the time when the ETF structures were first considered, and this idea of having shares of an open-end mutual fund traded in the secondary market, was a very big deal. And there was a lot of conversation about how that could actually be enabled. And now we see where the ETF industry is, and as Will highlighted, there are conversations now to expand the availability of dual share class open-ended funds. And so then you think about tokenization and where ETFs had the ability to be able to transact in kind in order to create better portfolio management efficiency. If you can trade the token, which is the wrapper of all of those assets in the secondary market, and have that be more efficiently transacted, then you are absolutely creating a much more efficient portfolio management construct where you don't have to go and mint and burn or redeem and subscribe each time you want to make a transfer of those assets.
And if you're in the commission's shoes, you're thinking about both broad principles and then the specifics, both very important. We'll get into the specifics in a moment around intermediaries and otherwise, but Robbie, why don't you talk us through in terms of broad principles in this space in terms of a pathway forward for the commission?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it has been covered in various ways, but the way that we would maybe summarize it from a BlackRock perspective is that as a baseline, the same security should have the same regulatory treatment regardless of the form in which it takes, whether that's traditional or now tokenized, with some exceptions, because that starting point is imperfect when we're talking about a new technology paradigm. And it raises two sort of sub-questions within it. The first being, what are some ways, tangible ways, that that is actually not happening today? And two is, what are some places where there is an inapplicability of the existing paradigm to a security that now lives in a tokenized format? So to give some examples, in the first category, as both Christine and Sandy talked about, being able to recognize that a blockchain is a perfectly valid, definitive record of ownership and transaction settlement. Discussions around broker-dealer ability to touch tokenized securities, to touch and settle in stablecoins, putting aside some of the challenges that Chair Atkins noted in the open around the special purpose broker-dealer framework for crypto broadly. We would say that tokenized securities got caught up unduly in that, and that pretty clearly broker-dealers would benefit from the ability to trade, to custody tokenized securities, as well as to transact in stablecoins. And then the second category, some things that are novel opportunities that if you just stuck rigidly to that principle of same security, same regulatory approach, we would lose some of the potential benefits that this technology provides. The discussion that I gave earlier and others added to around collateral, where tokenization makes the opportunity for collateral much broader and much more efficient, but that requires rethinking some of the existing regulatory paradigms that we have put in place under the existing traditional infrastructure. Another being in the area of KYC and AML, where not only would it limit some of the frictionless interoperability and liquidity that this technology offers by being able to, or by being forced to, issuer by issuer, fund product by fund product, go through an onboarding and KYC process, but actually it misses an opportunity to create a much more robust and transparent AML KYC system, potentially in enabling some form of decentralized utility powered by smart contracts to actually manage a transparent process and ability to port credentials, KYC credentials, across issuers and across fund types. Now, the industry has not yet built such a structure, but there likely will come a time where that happens, and it'll be incumbent on us to have a constructive dialogue such that we can help shape a regulatory approach to actually unlocking the power of that breakthrough.
Sticking with regulation for a moment, intermediary categories. I've heard, we've touched on transfer agents, broker-dealers. Alex, and then maybe Christian, as you look at the existing framework, what should change, what's working well? Over to you.
Yeah, I think with immobilized securities, the structure that we have works very well, right? I mean, as you were alluding to, there's trillions of dollars that is transacted on a daily basis. I think when you move on chain, I think there's opportunity. Like I was alluding to, there's really an issuer and there's investors, and then everything else can kind of work its way back from there. Broker-dealers can exist on-chain, right? And they can have a wallet infrastructure that can work and facilitate that. National securities exchanges can exist on-chain, but don't necessarily need to exist on-chain, right? DeFi protocols that facilitate automated market making, there's not really an intermediary there, and that's possible and should be permitted. And so I think there, what we have to do is take a step back, look at the various, like I was saying, the various risks that are involved, and ensure that those are being adequately met. But I think one of the things that has been alluded to is arbitrage in a negative way, but we also just just brought up the ETF, which is one of the greatest innovations and is driven by arbitrage. And so like having the ability to have, and to beat the dead horse, interoperability, or the ability for securities on-chain and securities off-chain to move and go back and forth with each other very much mitigates a lot of the concerns and the risks with regards to price dislocation. Right now that exists in our market structure, there's securities that are listed in Canada and securities that are listed in the United States, and there's numerous empirical studies that show that they trade within parity because there is this ability to arbitrage and keep prices within parity. So I think all we need to do is ensure that risks are properly viewed and addressed, and we think you can do that through a transfer agent or a third party that is, similar to national rating agencies. They have a technical capability of determining, the creditworthiness of an instrument. Maybe there similarly could be a type of intermediary that can review and judge various DeFi protocols to ensure that they meet certain standards and thresholds for resiliency and technical capabilities. So I think really just right-sizing the risks for on-chain activity and ensuring the ability for the national market system to exist in these subsystems through the ability to move securities on-chain and off-chain, and then filling in the gaps from there with regards to what technical registration is needed is how the approach or the commission should take, rather than saying we have a clearing agency, a broker-dealer, and an issuer in this context, and we need them in this other context. I don't think that's how that rigid approach should be taken.
Yeah, so I think intermediaries will and frankly are evolving in response to this technology. I also think, and Una raised this in terms of the issuer voice or the investor voice, intermediaries are obviously a hot topic of debate when we talk about tokenization or digital assets, but if you go back to first principles, I think they have pros and they have cons, and some of the pros are if you're an individual investor and you have the rest of your life happening, you want an intermediary who's going to do that vetting of different chains to make sure that they meet certain standards for security, for resiliency. You want parties to be able to you want to outsource that ability to other parties so that you can do the things you want to do. So I think in terms of the future trend, it really is about choice. There may be some market participants who want a more intermediated interaction with tokenized assets than others. Certainly they'll take into account costs and what people may characterize as rent-seeking or basically frictions, but they may see trade-offs in terms of the ability of scaling through an intermediary, the ability to deal with concerns about protection, security, and access. And I think that just needs to sort of play itself out organically over time. And the point's well taken. You can have registered entities that are showing up on chains. You can have through smart contract technology, the functions of registered entities acting. The last point I would note is, if you are started moving away from the status quo intermediated market structure, and look, I think one of the great promises of this technology is it gives us a new ability, as others have described on this panel, to deal with long-standing frictions that come through the current intermediated market structure. So there's definitely benefits for all here. But one thing we are talking about trading up here a little bit is financial risk for just very, very, I think, fundamental technology risk, relying on chains and smart contracts, automated market makers to be there to perform when you need them for capital formation, for pulling money out of your 529 so you can pay for your kids' college that's coming up. So I think something that needs to continue to remain in focus is what are the technology resiliency standards and who's going to enforce those? Is the commission going to directly enforce those? Or are they going to, again, look to software providers? I know we've tried to get away from that, right? That can be problematic with unintended consequences. But the bottom line is I think intermediaries stay in the mix, but maybe the choice of intermediation is expanded, and that's probably a good thing.
I want to make sure we get to regulatory innovation programs. We have about 15 minutes left, just under that. Cynthia, Commissioner Peirce on May 8th made a statement about a potential SEC exemptive order that would allow firms to use DLT to issue, trade, and settle eligible tokenized securities. Sounds very interesting. As you think about this topic broadly, pilots, regulatory sandboxes, what comes to mind for you?
Very much supportive of having more formal programs of the sort, as a lot of firms are investing heavily into developing applications on-chain for financial activities. And so there's a few terms that I think have been used across different global jurisdictions for these kinds of programs, whether it's a sandbox, a safe harbor, or a pilot. And they take different forms of whether it is a group of market participants across the entire transaction chain to participate and using real market value in order to demonstrate how it is that this technology can actually facilitate a particular activity, whether it is trading and settlements on a blockchain, or whether it is issuing new products on the blockchain. And so I think all of that is incredibly helpful and productive for participants to be able to actually operate these applications. Some of the challenges, though, is where you start to set, what are the objectives for having this proliferation of projects, and what are the objectives that you're hoping to be able to demonstrate, whether it is for a new market and trading ecosystem. We've talked across the panel today about a number of practical issues. So how do you actually get to a scalable pilot to be able to address many of these considerations? And then the other consideration is global regulatory participation, given how global our capital markets are. Having global policymaker coordination and collaboration as you think about these on-chain assets moving across jurisdictions. Technology is cross-border. How do we, and I think we talked a lot about the word interoperability, how do different regulatory regimes recognize these assets as they become available to individuals within their jurisdictions? And so, the idea of a sandbox is incredibly productive and helpful as we want to facilitate innovation. But I do think that there are a number of considerations that will go into creating a program that will be durable.
Will?
Well, I'm going to echo many of those points and first start off by commending Commissioner Peirce for her remarks and the guidance there to develop the regulatory sandbox for us. We believe the SEC should formally move forward with that concept and definitely support it. As just discussed, I think one of the big issues is about bringing innovation onshore. So how do we maintain the sort of most trusted regulatory framework in the world and the competitive capability to continue to attract capital? I think comes from the spirit of innovation. And this is something that I think we have the ability to adapt the framework to drive that onshore and to do these safe harbor and pilot programs that allow it to bring it into the appropriate regulatory framework that has served our investors so well. So whether that is, completely calibrated or time-bound, I think there's the question of how do we implement this? Do we crawl, walk, run into innovation? How do we pull people into it so that we can coalesce around the protocol choices and understand that? And I think key participants like exchanges, the members-based framework, and DTCC can be leaders in this space that enable us to work toward a common solution.
So we have about 8 minutes left. There's two other questions we can get to that we don't have to get to them, but I wanted to just pause and see any of the panelists, as you're synthesizing the different comments that have been made, anyone want to jump in with anything that's lingering?
I'd just like to add one thoughtful request in designing, because I agree with Cynthia and Will's points about, really the benefit of having a robust sandbox environment and what it could create for us. I would just encourage us, though, to make it a practical sandbox, right? A lot of the early sandboxes focused on what could the technology do. I think there's pretty widespread understanding now throughout the world on what the technology is capable of doing, right? And so I would encourage any sandbox we design at this late stage in the game to be very focused on how can the pilot run in the sandbox, or how can the test run in the sandbox directly inform the creation of legislation or the creation of new regulatory rules that would allow us to improve and move the system forward, right? I think the time for experimental sandboxes is past, and it's time for sandboxes that are going to prove out how new rules might operate. That would be my only real request for in thinking about and designing this program.
Johnny?
Yeah, and just on that note, being somewhat crypto native, this might seem counterintuitive to folks in the audience, but what would be really interesting to me would be able to use, a tokenized treasury in various forms in DeFi. Right now, the actual user experience to hold a tokenized treasury is terrible. No offense, but I can't do anything with it. I can look at my securitized account balance, and that's it. But if I could borrow against it, if I could readily swap it, if I could be a market maker and get some yield from the volume that comes through the pool, that would be amazing. And it's at the low end of the risk curve, so frankly, it's not much different than a stable coin. When you get down to the root of it, stable coins are slowly becoming the world's checking account. I think US Treasuries could become the world's savings account. And I think that'd be a really actionable and interesting thing to see.
Another theme that comes up pretty often is thinking about a, quote, level playing field around regulatory obligations with TradFi on one hand and then emerging technologies on the other. Una, it's a broad topic, but what do you think is important for the commission to keep in mind, whether on a pilot, a sandbox, or otherwise? Over to you.
Sure. I think the important themes are investor trust, market acceptance, and keeping the benefits that we currently have and translating that into this new technology in terms of how it's integrated into our U.S. markets. And I think it's also important to just take a step back and think about the U.S. public markets as really the primary access point for Americans to be able to take advantage of the economic growth, whether it's for building financial security or planning for retirement or paying for college, and building generational wealth both as individual families and as a nation as a whole. And we've also talked about the perspectives of corporate issuers in terms of making sure that there is a clear set of rules and obligations and rights that they have by accessing the capital markets, and also just taking on those responsibilities as a public market in the U.S. economy. So I think that's an important piece. And in that context, the Congress has empowered the Commission to promote fair competition. And so my own personal interpretation is that you treat like assets alike, and you treat market participants who are performing the similar functions in the same way. So as we sort of think about all the topics that we've discussed today, and it's probably helpful to think about not just intermediaries or the parties in question, but what is the purpose that we serve within the financial ecosystem. And we should think about what are the risks embedded at time delay risks versus economic costs associated with different sort of processes versus speed, efficiencies, and how those might also have risks embedded in them, and just sort of figuring out what those are to make sure that those standards and the rules that are applied to all of the market participants are consistent, with the understanding of what the embedded risks are, as well as the sort of the more obvious ones.
Yeah, I couldn't echo more how important the financial markets are in the United States and how impressive and robust the U.S. markets are in the world. I would echo, I think, what Commissioner Peirce mentioned in her in advocating for the sandbox, or in the sense where standing still is falling behind when technological innovation is moving very quickly. And so we need to, with care and creativity, look to foster innovation and leverage and utilize the best technology that we have. I think there's many ways to skin a cat, and so we should not be beholden to using a pair of scissors just because we've used them over the years. If there's an automatic razor, we should use that because I'm sure the cat's been nicked many, many times. And so I think we should kind of internalize the fact that just because we've done something through convention doesn't mean it's the best way that things have been done. I mean, and there's numerous instances where we've had instances where the system has bent but not broken, and we shouldn't then say we have reached, Fukuyama or whatever is great in saying we're at the end of history. We're not at the end of history. We're continuing to innovate, and utilizing this technology can allow for that. And the amount of capital that's locked up for settlement risks and the amount of capital that's not able to be freely deployed is just immense. And so I think I welcome the opportunity for innovation and experimentation, because I think we can move things forward, and the fact that fractionalization and 24/7 are things that where crypto markets have kind of tried to influence the traditional markets, they're not good fits. Where they are good fits are in the markets where they were created, where things go out 6 to 10 to 12 decimal points, and the markets operate on a 24/7 basis. And so we shouldn't be beholden to the past. We should look to the future, but that doesn't mean we do away with everything. We want to make sure they can all work together.
Robbie?
Jeff, I think on this question of level playing field, there's an important principle that we not lose sight of here, which is that we not fall into the trap of incumbents attempting to hamstring new technology players by the same potentially obsolete or due for modernization regulations that they face, as opposed to leaning into the new opportunities created by the novel technology. I think one very natural example of this is that banks to date, for instance, had not been able to engage on public blockchains. And while we advocate a technology-neutral approach between public and private, it's become very clear that the vast majority of traction and utility in this space is on public blockchains. And now, fortunately, there does seem to be an opportunity for banks to be unhamstrung in that way, and to be able to take advantage in the same way that the new technology entrants in this place have been. Just one other clarification on Johnny, on the point around tokenized treasuries and treasury funds today. We can actually now, for the first time, deliver those on a peer-to-peer basis in secondary market liquidity and pledge them as collateral, including in our case with our fund with Securitize, although that's relatively recent, so I understand that.
Well, we are
Superstate also does that, FYI.
we are at 3:30 exactly, so I want to thank the panelists. Very thoughtful, very constructive. Thanks for traveling to Washington, and please join me in giving them a hand.
Thank you, Jeff.
All right, I'd also like to echo that thanks. Thank you so much for everyone on the panel. We've had a great first discussion, and I look forward to our next one. Today we heard a lot about how much promise can be unlocked in a tokenization wrapper. Long before blockchain, another great innovation unlocked many benefits in a once new wrapper. It was an ice cream wrapper. Like instant settlement, it offered instant joy. It serves as a snack, a dessert, and an excuse to bond with someone you like. So many utilities in one space, just like tokenization might offer. Before we go out, I ask you to look to the people next to you, and if you don't know them, please introduce yourself. One of the main benefits of these roundtables, other than the discussions we have up here, are the relationships you form. So please continue the conversations you've heard and enjoy an ice cream outside, and we'll meet back here at 4 o'clock for our next panel. Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. We are getting ready to start our second panel here. So, Tiffany, I'm going to hand it off to you, and we're looking forward to another great panel. The first one was wonderful, and we expect great things from you all as well. So, Tiffany, it's all yours.
Thank you, Commissioner Peirce. Thank you to the Commissioner. So thank you to the Commission, Commissioner Peirce and the Crypto Task Force for all of the work that they're doing in putting this together. It's a privilege to be here. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago talking to clients about how we really should have a roundtable on these topics, and here we are having a roundtable. So thanks again to the important work that you're all doing. In the interest of time, we're not going to have each panelist introduce themselves, but their bios are all available online, and they are all amazing. They have very different perspectives and backgrounds, and so it's really going to lead to a robust discussion. One of the main jobs of the Roundtable and the Crypto Task Force is finding a way out of here, as Commissioner Peirce would say. And so I hope that these diverse perspectives and the discussion that we have today will give some insight into how we get there. One important thing to keep in mind is that when we're talking about tokenization, we're talking about a market that exists today, that has existed for some time. And so we're going to be touching both on what's happening today and how we move forward into the future of tokenization, how we get to the benefits, how we eliminate the risks or mitigate them, and how we can help the industry reach its full potential. So with that lead up, we're going to start with a very big, grand question. And I'm going to go to Georgia for this one to kick us off. So how should we think of tokenization? Is it an asset, or is it a technology, or maybe both?
Okay, here goes. Just to quickly start, I want to say thanks to the Commission and to the task force. I'm honored to be here. I also would like to just express gratitude for the format that we are in today, where we can kind of eliminate all of the obligatory grandstanding before we just get down to the problems and the solutions. So let's get some solutions. When I think about tokenization, I think of it as a process that uses a technology. So it is a process that takes an asset and simply represents it and transfers thereof on a blockchain. As noted by both Commissioner Peirce and many of the other panelists earlier today, it really doesn't change or in general, it doesn't change the fundamental substance of the thing itself. So in this case, we're taking a security, we are tokenizing it, and putting it on a blockchain. It is still a security. And I want us to be very clear about that. Because it is still a security, it requires certain controls to be put in place. Things like AML, potential transfer restrictions, certain requirements about holders and their accreditation status. And what's great about using blockchain technology is we can layer that with a smart contract, which is written and administered by a transfer agent, let's say, or I love this term that has been being used, a tokenization agent, in order to create these controls that eliminate a lot of the risks that are intended on using just a pure permissionless blockchain. And so what do I mean by that? Well, one of the big fears with digital assets are that you lose the keys. And what do? The asset is gone. Well, by having a smart contract on top and a tokenization agent who can burn and remint those digital assets, that risk is mitigated. And similarly, if you have broken trades during transactions, or you have bad actors that try to steal the assets in some way, again, all of that can be remedied using this smart contract that sits atop. So importantly, I want to be very clear when we're talking about tokenized securities that we are not talking about the bearer assets of a lot of the kind of crypto native assets. We're talking about something that does have a lot of built-in controls specific to the technology and because of this technology that we're using. Thank you.
Hillary, what would you like to add to that?
Well, I agree that, yes, I agree that it's a technology rather than an asset. And when I think about technologies, I think it's helpful to think about what problem are we trying to solve with this technology, because I think that really helps us understand what's going on. So I think really it's clear that this technology isn't going to solve financial inclusion issues. I mean, you sometimes hear that discussed, but really half of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. The issue isn't that there aren't enough investment opportunities, it is that people don't have enough money to invest. So I think what's really driving this is a desire for efficiencies for people who are already in the markets, more or less. So where are we trying to get efficiencies out of this? Well, there's a lot of talk about sort of making securities, digital. Most financial, well, at least most securities regulated by the SEC, I think have already been digital in some form or other for a long time. There are assets that aren't digital, and there's a lot of talk about real-world tokenization, but the challenge there isn't the technology. It's sort of reconciling the fact that you have one record of ownership and then physical assets that are out there moving in the real world, and how do you get those to match up? It's not a technology problem, it's a real challenge, but it's not one that I think tokenization really speaks to. So where I sort of see it, the discussion about efficiencies is sort of in two prongs. There's this sense that the public permissionless blockchain can bring efficiencies, and this sense that the composability and programmability brings efficiencies. And I want to note that they don't have to go together. Smart contracts predate blockchain technology. They can work with any kind of database or ledger. And I think that that's something to really focus on, given that the public permissionless blockchains themselves are inherently less efficient than more centralized alternatives. They have to be, otherwise it would be too easy for a sort of a bad guy, if you will, to take over the ledger. So I think it makes sense to really focus on experimentation with the programmability and composability on a more traditional type of ledger rather than the blockchain. And in fact, that's what we're seeing a lot around the world. So the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK does a lot of pilot programming with tokenization on permissioned ledgers. There's been a lot of experimentation by the Bank for International Settlements in that regard as well. So yeah, I do see this as a plumbing change, but I think we should think about why we want this plumbing change. And if it is about gaining efficiencies through programmability and composability, I think experimentation, it's sort of jettisoning the inefficiencies of the permissionless public blockchain are a good place to start.
Gene, do you want to respond to that?
One man's inefficiency is the other man's opportunity. I think it's both a digital asset and a technology. And one of the things we're doing with Permuto Capital, a joint venture of ourselves and some ex-folks from Credit Suisse First Boston, is actually taking blue chip stocks and pulling them apart into their dividend component and everything else, and trading those separately both on the Chia blockchain and the New York Stock Exchange. The efficiencies here are really extreme. A couple things to come to mind. For investors, you can buy 0.001 of a share. This has been a problem. I mean, you can do this in a sense at Robinhood because they will in the background make it work for you, but you didn't actually own that. And some of us have remembered 2008 and remember it was not a nice time to necessarily have to trust your broker or your clearing agency. But the other piece is in administering this product, it's going to be really difficult on DTCC. When an underlying company issues a reverse stock split or a spin out, being able to not decimalize becomes a tremendous pain in the derriere when you're actually trying to go and run one of these sorts of funds. And in fact, without the blockchain, we probably never would have done this sort of project in the first place. And my favorite version of this is tax. We're going to have to actually issue K-1s to people who invest in these so they can get their accredited investor dividend treatment. We have to pay about $300,000-400,000 to someone who goes and searches down everybody's social security number and name in the brokerage firms in the US. On the blockchain, we write it once and you come in, signify that you've got your correct wallet or vault, and all of a sudden we generate your K-1 in real time for basically free. So, that is just a sense of what the opportunities are here. Now, I want to be clear, I'm talking about real securities. So there is no distinction in my mind. It's not, is Bitcoin a security? It's certainly not. But is a Microsoft dividend certificate issued by a Delaware trust a security? Absolutely, and it's going to be registered on Form S1. So I think that there are important points here that we can hope to choose regulations that would somehow box these things in. But liquidity and access are always hiding here. And so the reason that public blockchains are very powerful, even with their limitations of slightly slower transaction times, is not because, well, I'll say it this way, is an opportunity to have a 24/7, 365 market only mitigated by the size of the Pacific Ocean. So you're talking about a totally different liquidity profile for every asset out there. You know, today we only trade national market stocks during the day East Coast time. That is going to end pretty quickly as you start to see real assets that are tradable 24/7, 365. And I think there are opportunities there that people miss. The ability for you to rehypothecate, to be able to dedicate that capital in a different direction because you realize at 3 in the morning that something is amiss. So I think it is both, and I think you cannot ignore how much more capable the technology makes the asset.
Kelly.
Well, I represent one of the technology firms around the table, Public Blockchain, so it's probably not going to stun you all by telling you that I think of it as a technology and not as an asset. But I come more from the financial markets. So as I was thinking about the answer to this question, frankly, I was reflecting on the fact that I had started in capital markets in 1987, which actually means that I've seen all or part of 5 decades of capital markets activity. I've seen program trading and the advent of online trading, the introduction of the internet. I've seen the creation of derivatives and futures and options and ETFs and structured products and different types of packaged funds and the like. And it's interesting that this question gets asked. I think when I reflect on all of that, what's common as I think about all of those market cycles that I lived through is that the product creation or the product design led, and the technical implementation became the way of delivering that product design. So the market started with a conversation about some market anomaly or opportunity or aberration or gap that could be addressed or capitalized on. And technology became the follow-on conversation for how would I best achieve that or pursue it. And so there really was never the question of whether the technology was the asset. We were already talking about the asset, and the technology was simply how it was going to be delivered. And for the record, I hear every CIO I ever worked with saying, yes, that's the way it should be. Kelly, don't tell me how to solve something. Just tell me what the design requirements are. The difference is, though, is that I think here the reason the question gets asked is because we are leading with a conversation about the technology. We're leading with an understanding of how many of the things that we do in the market could be better or differently achieved by using a different way of approaching them with, oddly enough, something that's rather very simple and straightforward, a better set of database management, a better way of achieving books and records. But it's sort of that flip by talking about the technology first that I think has given rise to the question in frankly, a very logical way. And so, I joke when I was saying I'm representing Digital Asset, one of the technology companies, a layer 1 blockchain. Of course I'm going to say that. But really what I think is that it's, and I might say I echo a little bit of what Jean has said. I don't know if I'd go so far as to say that it is an asset, but I think it's the convergence of the two that is giving rise to the question and the discussion around it, meaning this isn't an asset creation first, and then how do I solve it from a technology perspective? My age-old question, the discussions I had with the CIOs in the businesses I was part of. Instead, what we have is a more virtual circle of discussion going on. First, tell me what the technology can do, and then let me think about how it can apply to some market instances or market anomalies. And then let's talk a little bit more about how the technology can address them, but what I need to be worried about. We are seeing, I think, the technology become part of the asset. The technology features are part of the definition of the asset itself. And I say this in a way that for all of the sobering thought that I have, that I've been in a market condition for the capital markets across 5 decades, of realizing that yet for all of that time, in all of the products that were created and all of the market cycles that I've been part of, it's always been a conversation about how I think about, yes, the market risk of something that I'm doing, or the credit or lending if I'm borrowing to do it, or how I feel about the counterparty that I'm interacting with. but it's always been the binding constraint of the settlement risk that I'm dealing with. We'll talk about market and credit and counterparty, but ultimately what I do is, and how the technology applies to solution is often dependent on the settlement or on the operating constraints. They are the 800-pound gorilla in the room that ultimately dictates what can be done when and how. And I think what's different about this is we are now for the first time talking about unleashing ourselves from that binding constraint and knowing what it means to be able to define trading processes, services, assets, and their characteristics that are unbounded by those operating systems that can be managed, moved, delivered, is probably not the right word, but transferred in terms of value ownership 24/7 across a global market, across jurisdictions, and can do so at the speed of the internet in a real-time basis. So is it an asset or is it a technology? I think it's firmly a technology, but it's a technology that is now, and hopefully forevermore, ushering in an era where the asset and the technology are part of one definition of what's being created for market participants and what is being solved for from a market infrastructure perspective.
Excellent. Thank you, each of you, for those explanations. Before we move on to the next topic, one thing I'll throw out, and this goes perfectly to Kelly's comments. We've heard a lot today about the fact that a security is tokenized or put on the blockchain doesn't change the essence of what it is. But as I think back about some cases over the past couple of years, you had security-based swaps, or you had swaps, right? So is it that we've now coalesced around what a tokenized security is, right? Or do we still have other variations we should be thinking about and being clear about when something is a swap and does not have all the rights and privileges of the actual security versus being a tokenized security? So I leave that to anyone who wants to answer.
That comment struck me as well in the earlier panel about once we have this stock security, this tokenized security, it's not a different animal when we put it on a public blockchain than it would be otherwise. And I'll talk about this more, I'm sure, when we get into the risks of these tokenized securities. But from my perspective, it's a very different animal because it has a totally different risk profile. And the risk profile changes because of the operational risks and the risks that participants within the underlying blockchain systems will act in ways that change the record-keeping reliability. So I disagree strongly with that characterization.
Interesting. So Gene's going to get in before we go to the next topic. Go ahead, Gene.
Yeah, I would just say I think it really matters who the issuer is. And what I mean by that is, when you're talking about a corporate issuer or, a well-known issuer 40 Act company, those kinds of things, we have a regulatory regime for all of those issues. So when you're dealing with a direct issuance, and this is why I don't like the word tokenization too much, because it often has this implication that some third party is going to put a basket of stuff somewhere and they're going to sell you that. But if you're actually the issuer, there's no real difference. It's just that you're now actually disintermediating a bunch of steps between the issuer and yourself and can actually self-custody directly and go back to the 1930s about how you actually could hold securities and manipulate securities. So, I think it comes closer to being a security-based swap when it's not the traditional issuer in the issuer word's sense.
Yeah.
Can I add just a quick point?
Go.
Yeah, I think when we think about respect the other opinions on the panel entirely, but I think that when you're talking about tokenization, particularly of real-world assets, a U.S. Treasury and a tokenized U.S. Treasury are one and the same thing. They are not two separate things. They are not a separation of their features or their functionality or the rights and obligations and conditions. They are one and the same, or at least that's the intent, and that's hopefully what comes out of the work and the discussion that we're having with the SEC and other regulatory authorities. And I think that's really important to understand. The technology applied to the tokenization of a real-world asset is frankly, in many ways, no different to the dematerialization that occurred when we went from paper form to electronification form. There will be new tools, new ways of interacting with that asset. There'll be benefits, there'll be challenges that will need to be managed for sure. But a tokenized real-world asset and a real-world asset and its tokenized form are, in point of fact, one and the same, and therefore not adding any inherently different risks or governance or oversight activities that wouldn't be required of the asset itself. And that's why it's critically important that we think about it as the expression of the regulatory requirements, the shape of that asset, and the legal and contractual requirements on transferring it between parties is translated into a digital form. And that's really not more than that when we call it tokenization.
Excellent. So let's move on to the next topic, starting with Johan. So can you walk us through some of the benefits of tokenization?
Yes, absolutely. I think we have been discussing a few of them already in the previous panel, but actually just because we discussed about financial inclusion, we do believe at Robinhood that tokenization can reduce a lot of the barrier for retail and advance the way for investors that are usually kind of excluded from the market to access a sophisticated market. We also think that it will encourage innovation in the industry in areas like microfinance, tokenized remittances, local capital formation. And we do believe that, you know, the financial inclusion will come also because of the fractionalization like we discussed. That is something by default, and if you're trying to be a retail investor investing for the first time in a large stock like Amazon, having fractionalization will be something that is extremely important. There will be also the reduction of cost because we are removing middleware and middle men everywhere across the trade. And we also think that we will be able to increase competition. I don't know if any of you has tried to transfer from one brokerage to another and use the so-called ECAD system, but it will take multiple days. You don't really know what's happening. And because of this friction, many people just stick with their current broker. And so we think that with tokenization, we can actually make this process seamless, instant, and bring a lot more the power to customer to decide which broker they should use. So that's one aspect on the financial inclusion. And then some of the advantage that we discussed before were around the liquidity and market access. You know, we think that offering 24/7 global access will reduce the reliance on the broker, on the market hours, and that's also something that will include more and more of the retail space when they can actually trade when they are not at work or when they are not blocked from using an application. There will also be cost and operational efficiency. So I know we talked a lot about real-time settlement before. T+0 is definitely something that, you know, is ambitious, but at the same time, the capital requirements that will be reduced because of this are extremely important, and also the credit risk. And so that will increase the competition in the market. That will allow more institutions to come in. And the worry around net settlement and things like this, like we discussed before, this can all be solved with the right implementation, with the right smart contract, with the right you know, use of stable coin versus cash and this kind of thing. So, you know, I think we need to be convinced that some of this problem can be solved with technology and not just stop there because we are worried about it. And then one of the two other points that we really care about is transparency and compliances. You know, blockchain provide a verifiable audit trail, which is something that is very important. Compliance rule like KYC, AML, and everything can be coded directly. We already do that for many of crypto transfer, and so it's something that is really easy to apply to tokenization of real-world asset. And finally, I think the price discovery and capital formation is going to be one of the main key points. Tokenization will open new capital channels, and global marketplace will actually develop around it. We already see it in other places that have been a bit more advanced in tokenization, like in Hong Kong or in Singapore. And we see a lot more of this investor participation in that space.
Excellent. Joshua, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I am probably the odd person out on this whole day. I represent a VC, and we invest in startups that are building in the space, kind of rather than coming from kind of TradFi or at an operating company. And I guess I've been in the space for 8 years, and I used to kind of jokingly, when I would sit on panels, ask if there was anybody from the SEC in the audience, and so they caught me, and jokes on me, they've dragged me up here to ask me questions, but I think what that represents is a really incredible shift in the discussion opportunity. Basically, I've spent the last 8 years of my career trying to convince people that this is a real life technology. I believe it's a technology. And that it has real applications for capital efficiency and financial inclusion, and to expand, right, not replace, but expand our financial rails, right, how we move capital assets across the globe. And so in light of that, I think Commissioner Crenshaw had some interesting questions, and I want to address some of those. So scalability, again, from the perspective of someone who's investing in this space for a long time, are blockchains as scalable as centralized repositories for trading activity? No, they're not. Not today. They're not as efficient. They're not as fast, right? But let's look at the trajectory of the technology over, call it, the last 10 years. So we're coming up on almost 10 years of Ethereum being a chain. Let me just use that as an example. Many people know it. When it first launched, we had a whopping transactions per second of 15. Just 15, not 15 anything else, just 15 transactions per second, which is paltry, right? Fast forward about 5 years later, we have the advent of rollups for that layer 1 blockchain, and that increased to about 1,000, right? 1,000 transactions per second. That sounds pretty good, but actually it's not, right? We're 100x at least that in terms of traditional financial markets. Today, 2025, we're looking at least experimentally, but increasingly in live scenarios, right? We're looking at 65 to 100,000 transactions per second. Right now we're talking about actually being competitive with some of our centralized trading systems. That's really important. So yeah, today we're kind of still not there at a global scale, but again, as someone who has spent so much time trying to birth a new technology into the world, this is what we expect from technological progress, right? We expect things to get better over time, right? And I think that's going to be a theme, at least for me, for this panel, of trying to identify why there are benefits to be achieved from engaging with this technology and allowing this technology to facilitate the types of activity that we already do in traditional markets, and also new types of activity with new types of assets and new types of financial primitives. The other thing I want to talk about is settlement cycle. So is it a benefit? Is it a detriment, right? I appreciate that netting is something that traditional financial markets participants enjoy the use of today. I think a really important point made in the prior panel was the fact that what we were talking about with T+0 settlement is providing optionality for marketplace participants. Netting does provide efficiencies. It's helpful. It still requires margining, so it doesn't eliminate costs of trading. And there may be times where your preference for your ability to net out transactions over the course of some set period of time outweighs the cost of margining and collateral that is still required for that transaction, for that process. But wouldn't it also be great if you decided that you didn't want those costs of capital and you instead wanted to be able to transact atomically in instant settlement, right? So those are things that very difficult to do when you have layers of intermediaries that are inserting themselves by necessity, right, in the execution, clearing, and settlement of transactions, right? What this technology enables is the automation of many parts of that system, right? We're enabling automated action that is taken by, code, mathematics. That code doesn't have self-interest, doesn't have people that kind of work behind the scenes as you would have at a clearinghouse or a broker-dealer or a centralized exchange, right? That code is going to execute on the basis of rules and principles that have been built into the system, right? Surely there is benefit to being able to rely on the programmatic execution of processes in a financial trading market, right? And then, another point was, well, there's just not that many people use these markets, these decentralized marketplaces, or engage with tokenized assets. That is true. In 1995, not that many people used the internet as well, right? And so again, like we need to think about how this technology progresses. I would say that it's probably our preference in our best interest from regulating markets perspective that we not hope to engage with this technology once it is fully baked and we've answered all the questions, right? But instead, we come to the table now and enable some of the market participants today, like some of the panelists from, I was honestly really surprised to agree with many of the things that the panelists on the former panel said, right? People want to do this, and so we need to find regulatory solutions that enable participation in these types of ecosystems.
Thanks, Joshua. So we're going to go. So that's kind of laying the foundation for something we're going to talk about later. Now, before we get to the future, right, and what should happen next, let's talk about, we did a nice job summing up the benefits of tokenization. I think Sid wants to add something.
Yeah, I think just before we move on from the benefits, one of the things that I can talk about is just our practical experience tokenizing private credit. So we effectively have kind of two core products at Maple. Both involve secured lending to institutions, which is over collateralized by digital assets. But I think for one of the products that's available here in the US, what we're able to do by tokenizing these assets is to give the lenders, the capital providers, visibility real time into the performance of the portfolio. So one of the key benefits is transparency into both the performance of the loans as well as the collateral backing of the loans. Another thing is that we're able to settle these loans pretty well instantaneously. So we've actually done settlements of loans at 10 p.m. on a Saturday before. So we're not really constrained by the use of the banking system. And then the other element is liquidity. So people who provide capital into these forms of loans are generally able to get that capital back within 30 days. And that's because when somebody puts money into a pool, the loans are being repaid all the time. So a repayment from a loan can allow a redemption of capital, or a new deposit from somebody else can allow that redemption to occur. But the other interesting thing I thought I'd touch on is that we also have a version of this product that's indeed a little bit more relaxed from a DeFi perspective and is a little bit more DeFi native. This product is not available in the US. However, with this product, we can kind of see an A/B test being run in real time. So the product has secondary liquidity, so you're able to swap it on Uniswap, other decentralized exchanges, and this allows the user or the holder of that tokenized asset to get much better liquidity and the ability to redeem at a much faster rate than somebody who's in the other product, which is only limited to accredited investors. We've also seen an increase inclusion in that we often see deposits or inflows that might be $5 or $10 in size. So it does broaden access to more of a retail offshore market. And then we're actually able to see composability used in other DeFi protocols. So for anyone who's familiar with DeFi, there is a tool called Pendle, but what this allows you to do is to lock in fixed rates. So you can actually take this portfolio of private credit and then fix the rate that you're receiving from those loans.
And then finally, one other point I would make is that you can actually take the tokenized asset and use it as collateral in DeFi borrowing markets. So another integration that exists is Morpho at the moment. And so we've seen over 50 million pledged as collateral to be borrowed. But it just goes to show that some of the utility when you actually enable this interoperability is more participation at smaller size, being able to lock in fixed rates, being able to use it as collateral, and being able to access secondary liquidity on these assets.
Gene, you have something to add?
Yeah, and it's a small detail, but I think it's an important detail. When we talk about fractionalizing shares or decimalizing shares, there's an aspect of an ETF involved here. In the past, if you wanted broad market access, you generally had to use an ETF, even hedge funds that do this. But with the actual fractionalization of shares, you can say, hey, these are the 70 QQQ stocks that I care about, not the 100. And I can actually only take $5,000 and get exposure exactly like that and self-custody it. That is a thing we haven't really had the ability to do before. And so I think often when we're talking about some of these high-level terms, it's important to understand what it's really going to enable people to do.
Excellent point. So let's talk about some of the risks and challenges of tokenization and then how regulation can help protect against these risks and challenges. Let's start off with Hillary. It's been a while.
Okay, I'll try and be brief because I got a lot. So as I mentioned before, there's sort of two halves of this. There's the, are you going to do this on the permissionless public blockchain and the risks associated with that? And then there are the risks associated with the smart contracts, the programmability, the composability. So I'll start with the blockchain. So to a point that Angela already made, I mostly think that the heuristic of same activity, same risk, same rules makes sense. But when you're dealing with operational risks, that breaks down because new technologies do bring new risks. And there are a lot that we need to think about in the context of blockchains. Who maintains the blockchain software? Who are the validators? How are they regulated? Really, we have a whole infrastructure around regulating financial market utilities, particularly the PFMIs. I think the SEC really needs to look closely as to whether that's going to be applied to public permissionless blockchains if they are going to be infrastructure for real-world transactions, which, as I said, I do not recommend. There's the challenge that using public permissionless blockchains brings in new intermediaries. We often hear about it eliminating intermediaries. It really doesn't. I mean, you can look even at DeFi where you have to trust, whoever's maintaining your blockchain, whoever's validating your transactions. You have to trust the oracles that are being consulted for data by the smart contracts. So there's a lot of intermediaries there. They're not always the ones that we're traditionally used to regulating. They're also ones that may not even be obvious or visible. So I think there's a lot of risk associated with those new intermediaries who need to be addressed. I think Commissioner Crenshaw did a good job of talking about all the challenges that come from using these blockchains in terms of eliminating netting. I think there's sort of this sense that faster is always better and 24/7 transacting is always good. You can protect individual investors, but individual investors are all going to be harmed if the system collapses. And those kind of efficiencies in good times breed a lot of fragilities for bad times. We've seen time and time again when there's financial crises that pauses are the moments where you can stop, collect, fix things. I think if we eliminate all the pauses, then that's something that we'll come to regret. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get to the risks associated with smart contracts as well. There's also the issue of, Josh mentioned that scalability is getting better with blockchains. A lot of what's happening there is stuff happening off the blockchain. I think there are limitations on how scalable the blockchains themselves can become simply because they have to be inefficient or else it's too easy for the bad guys to take them over. So what we're seeing is lots of links between blockchains to try and create liquidity. And that's usually done by way of APIs. And so APIs also introduce a ton of operational risks. They are usually the most vulnerable from cybersecurity perspectives. They can also transmit problems from one chain to another. So that's another locus of operational risk that I think we need to be very careful about if we are going to put real-world assets on any kind of public permissionless blockchain. So now I'm going to shift a little bit and talk about the risks associated with the programmability aspect, the smart contracts. So here what you're trying to do is essentially pre-program for all future states of the world. And there is always uncertainty, right? And we have seen time and time again that when things are going wrong, a little bit of discretion, a little bit of grace, a little bit of flexibility is often necessary, even on sort of small scale interpersonal or sort of party-to-party transactions, but especially at the systemic level if things are going that big. You know, margin calls, if you automated them without allowing for any kind of intervention, could, in some circumstances, precipitate a full-blown meltdown. So we need to think, again, about the trade-offs between efficiency and fragility from pre-programming all of our transactions. There are sort of ways you can deal with that. You can have the smart contracts sort of reach out to an oracle, which is a data source, and that oracle could be used to pause transacting in the smart contracts, but that's going to require a lot of regulatory intervention with regards to the oracles, and that's something that I think the SEC needs to think about. There's also the financial stability risks of integrating traditional finance and crypto. Typically, crypto busts have been sort of kept contained within the crypto ecosystem. I worry that with more and more integrated products that sort of, you know, where a smart contract is sort of used to link a traditional financial asset with a crypto asset, that we're in a position to transmit risks within the very volatile crypto ecosystem into traditional finance more easily. One last thing, and then I'll stop, even though I could go on. I want to talk a little bit about fractionalization, because we hear a lot of talk about how tokenization enables this. Well, we've had fractionalization before. I mean, it's more or less securitization. And what we've seen is that when you sell pieces of assets rather than the whole asset, you can have a lot of liquidity problems. Because it's not always easy to map ownership of a piece of the asset onto the broader asset. And what that means is that in times of panic, people aren't going to be able to be sure that they have title to the full asset. They're only going to have title to their piece. Well, what's a bankruptcy court going to do with that? If I'm unsure, I'm going to panic. I'm going to start selling it at a discount. That's going to press down market prices. Then we could have spillover effects. So, you know, there are individual risks in all of this, but I really think it's critical that the SEC put on its sort of market financial stability hat as well as it looks at all of these and sees the fragilities that are the trade-offs for the efficiencies that are being marketed.
Thanks, Hillary. So I know we have a couple of operators here who've been working in this space, thinking about these issues for years. So I'm going to get at least two. Let's start with Sid, because I already told you I'm going to call you for this. So let's start with Sid, and then maybe who wants to raise their hand for next, then Georgia. Okay, so Sid and then Georgia.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some notable risks to tokenization that Hillary touched on. I think the ones that are kind of most evident to me as an operator in the space would be fragmentation of liquidity. We find this a lot when we're looking at which blockchains to deploy assets or our lending to. Most of our lending is currently done on Ethereum mainnet, so that's kind of where 90% of the volume lies today. And if we deploy on other blockchains, then we risk shrinking the business because we have all of the liquidity on Ethereum mainnet and not on, let's say, Solana or Avalanche or whichever other chain we're looking at. So I think this obviously poses a problem if you have one type of asset that's significantly less liquid on another chain, then that's going to be problematic for the holders. I will say that we are starting to see the market kind of take care of this problem. There's a few teams, notably Layer 0, Chainlink, Wormhole, who are trying to create interoperability between blockchains. And presently, we're evaluating all of these solutions, but I think we have decided on one. But where we will play this out in a real-time experiment will be the offshore private credit product that we have. We are going to be bridging that to different chains. And so I think this is an example of hopefully the fragmentation of liquidity becoming less of a problem through technical solutions that are being provided. I think the other notable area, though, where we see challenges with tokenization is, I was going to touch on the discrepancy between on-chain and off-chain records. This is definitely important. As Hillary noted, you might have title which lies off-chain on a legal record, but somebody else holding the token which they've purchased either OTC or they might have purchased on a decentralized exchange. I think this is one. This is a problem that we have encountered firsthand. So we have tokens which are not transferable that represent an interest in private credit loans, and then we have another version of this product which is transferable but similarly represents an interest in a portfolio of loans. But that product carries less rights with it because it's very difficult to attach the rights to tokens themselves. So I'd say this is an area where regulation can be very beneficial in assisting innovation in the space. If you're able to find a way to attach rights to tokenized assets, then I think that would be very important because it will just allow the two to operate in harmony. So you won't have a contract that says one thing and an asset that's being used on the blockchain that operates in a different kind of way. And then the other thing I would say is rule of law versus rule of blockchain. So we have legal contracts that govern the loans that we do, and then of course we settle the loans on-chain using stablecoins. So here you have the actual rule of law is applicable to the underlying rights of a lender in what we do, and I think it's very important to find a way to either codify that on-chain or recognize and once again link that to the tokenized asset itself. And the other point, just circling back to liquidity, I think if you're able to enable transferability of assets in a much simpler way, so this probably gets to KYC frameworks and how that needs to be done. For example, if I want to pledge a tokenized asset as collateral, and then the person that I'm pledging it to needs the right to be able to sell that, it's going to be much more beneficial if they can obtain a liquid price for that asset rather than needing to go through a much smaller segment of potential buyers that they have already KYC'd. And I'm talking about the use of decentralized exchanges in that instance. So I think that gets more to how we treat KYC when it comes to the KYC and AML regulation when it comes to these assets. But those are just a few of the points that I've noticed actually operating in the space.
Excellent. Georgia?
Yes, so just in the spirit of fulsome discussion, I was going to give a few counters to some of the risks raised by the use of public permissionless blockchains. And so just a few points that I'd like to raise are, Bitcoin is a blockchain, and it's been around for a while. And I think it's had less than 1 hour of downtime in the 14 years that it's been running. Number two is that public blockchains offer a better audit surface and transparency and resilience to insider risk. So transparency actually is the feature, not the bug. And when blockchains fail, it is public and it is noisy and it causes a commotion, but we know about it. And the public can come in and make changes and remedy the situation, leading to a stronger and more resilient blockchain. What happens when private systems fail is, well, I don't know, actually, because I get a letter in the mail like 2 years later from my bank saying, well, something bad happened and here's a subscription to Lock Life, hope it helps. Also, I think another thing to really keep in mind is that our economy really runs on open cryptographic infrastructure. Like our whole world, frankly, our information systems. So like the internet, TLS, SSL, Chromium, Firefox, WebKit, Linux, all these are open infrastructure, are open cryptographic infrastructure. So we do have test cases of this. I know there was concern about APIs, and APIs are a risk vector, absolutely, no question. But our financial system already uses hundreds of thousands of APIs. Swift is basically an API. And then I think finally, the most important point I want to make about all these risks, which I am not trying to make light of, I am just pointing out some mitigants, are that I think the strongest mitigant is when we talk about tokenized securities, we talk about an infrastructure that has these smart contracts on top that aren't running headless amok, but do have a tokenization agent to write and administer them to ensure that when the bad things happen, there is someone to be held accountable, but also to remedy the wrongs.
Excellent. So I know Angela and then Kelly. So let's make sure we can talk, we can respond, but let's also give recommendations. Like, right? It could be that the market will fix certain risks. They'll be mitigated that way, or maybe you need regulations to get them. So let's make sure we touch on that.
Okay, so I recently put worst case scenarioist in my X bio, so that's what I think about. You might have noticed that Hillary, I think, does as well. My concerns about the risks of these public blockchain systems, which it's very interesting to me because I've been in this space for a long time now. Started researching in about 2012, and have been through the discussions with the about what's going to happen with the financial sector moving its all of its record keeping onto blockchains. And in the 2016 time, it was all about it's going to be on permissioned ledgers, and so there was a whole flurry of building there, and public blockchains are far too scary. And today we're sitting here in 2025, and the tone of the first roundtable was very much that, well, duh, of course we'll get all these benefits of tokenization, and we'll just use this awesome record-keeping system that is there, these public blockchains. And there was a hint, I think, towards the end of the first panel about some of the risks of the public blockchains, but it was very much kind of glossed over. And I wrote about using public blockchains as financial market infrastructure way back in 2015. And I pointed out to these operational risks that exist within how software is developed in public blockchains, the maintenance of them, how they deal with emergencies and things like that. And so why am I up here beating a dead horse? Because these things haven't changed, okay? What's changed is the perception of public blockchains as legitimate. And we know that they've been here now for 15 years, and therefore they must be legitimate. They've had limited downtime during that time. Well, I would assert that just because they've endured a long time does not mean they're legitimate. Just like I would say for me, just because I've endured as a researcher for a long time doesn't mean I'm legitimate. You have to look at what I'm saying, right? So I would analogize what we're doing by saying, okay, well, they've been here long enough so we can put all of the, financial system record keeping on them, to kind of building a bridge and letting a bunch of kids play on the bridge with their little toys and their, doll carriages and everything like that. And then saying, okay, it's been here 15 years and nobody felt the bridge held up, so we're going to start driving Mack trucks over it now. Okay? It's a whole huge weight that we are wanting to put on these systems with the record keeping. Hillary did a great job highlighting a number of the operational risks. I would just like to make them a bit more concrete for you. So I just would like to say that Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Solana are kind of, big blockchains. The first two particularly have been around a long time. And we just heard, and I apologize, I can't see everybody's name up here. Georgia. We just heard Georgia talk about how things are public when things go wrong, and you can know what's going on and you can make adjustments. But that is not true based on the history of these public blockchains. Bitcoin had its secret bug fix in 2018, where some core developers and a few validators miners who they contacted individually noticed an inflation bug in the code that they fixed and did not tell anybody what was in this upgrade that the select miners ran, right, before it was announced weeks later that this had occurred, okay? Could have been catastrophic for the blockchain. People couldn't make their own decisions in real time, gave a lot of power to those people who are in the know who could have definitely, traded on that information. Same thing happened with Zcash. This time it was a flaw in the cryptography. This was around 2019, I think, where again, there was a secret bug fix amongst very few developers and validators who knew about this. Nobody else did, could have decimated the system. And lest you think these are old problems, I think I was just checking before we came on, there's a May 5th article about what happened in Solana this month, where there was, again, a catastrophic flaw in the cryptography used in, I believe, in there's zero-knowledge proofs, that a select number of developers and a select group of validators that they invited in made the bug fix, updated the network with it, didn't tell anybody what was going on until it was already resolved. Now, of course, this is probably a rational way of governing these systems, right, where you want people responding in an emergency who know what to do rather than let the system go down. But the people who are doing this have no obligations. Like, I've argued for years they should be treated as fiduciaries because they're caretakers of the system, but we persist in acting as if these systems are not controlled by or maintained by or that humans do not have critical roles in operating them. And finally, I just want to make one other point about our assumptions about the stability of blockchain systems have to do a lot with our belief that the game theory that is embedded in these systems is adequate to regulate them. Okay, so as long as the game theory works, then you don't have any people who can take advantage of things, who can attack the system. Like, it will always be protected and stable, right? The stability of these systems is why we think tokenization and using all financial record keeping, doing all financial record keeping on them is a good idea. But assuming that the game theory will work assumes that the system is closed and is not vulnerable to changes that occur outside the system in the real world, right? Thus changing all the incentives within the system. And just as one example of this that has become a huge deal across all blockchain systems that was not anticipated was the phenomenon of MEV, which was called miner extractable value initially. It's now taken on a new name, maximal extractable value. But I want to focus on just the miners or validators who are in this position. And basically, it was assumed that miners would only be paid within the system. But once they start taking payments outside of the system, right, that changes the incentives within the system. Once you start building layers, layer 2s and probably layer 3s and layer 16s at some point on this, that changes all the incentives at each of the levels along the way, right? So they become less predictable, and predictability with your record keeping of the entire financial system is kind of an important asset. I have many more things to say, but I will stop.
Okay, yeah, I know everyone has something to say. So Kelly is going to have the last word on this. And the last question of the day will get at this very dialogue we're having right now. I promise you we'll come back. So Kelly, go. Then we're going to have one more topic, and we're going to come back to.
Okay, and I'll try and be quick. I was just thinking about. I think there's some excellent points that have been made, and we are in the privileged position of getting the opportunity to work with a number of financial market participants, many of them. The large market FMIs that are doing real-world implementations with this technology now. And so I thought I'd just add a couple of comments on what's driving that and what, I don't know if they're really benefits or risks. I think it is absolutely appropriate to suggest that any new technology, any new operating system or operating activity of any point in time, if there are human beings involved in it, it is going to require some level of new governance or assessment of risk and the like. And so there's nothing about this that would actually change that. I'm also conscious of what I heard in my head when Commissioner Crenshaw spoke earlier of, be careful of the adage that when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so when I bring it back to thinking about what are those real-world implementations, and what risks or benefits or opportunities and challenges are they managing? What's emerging? Much of the discussion in the last panel focused on collateral management. It was near and dear to my heart. I ran collateral management and securities clearing at JP Morgan for over a decade, including around the crisis. So plenty of stories that talk about what technology failed at that time and the countless things we can do to improve it. But when you think about 24/7 markets and collateral mobility and the opportunity to tokenize the highly liquid real-world assets. Well, just to give you a statistic, there are 255 trillion or those of marketable securities in the world that are in demand for use as collateral in lending and as margin and the like. Only 28 trillion, which I realize is an enormous number, but only 28 trillion of the 255 is currently being used. That's about 11% of the market. I'm not arguing that, or the projects that we're working on isn't to suggest that, well, let's get to 97, 99% of that, but even doubling that amount has the important benefit of unlocking capital efficiency, liquidity, and financing on a real world and a global scale. And when you can have access to liquidity with transparency, not without privacy, but with transparency, where you know where your assets are being held and what they can be used as to meet collateral obligations, what they can be used to generate in terms of credit or liquidity, that improves market resiliency. So none of these projects are marching towards that with unbridled, sort of misplaced enthusiasm for let's throw out all of the rule book and go towards this wonderful new 24/7 operating model, but it is about having a much more calm, controlled way of looking at the world and saying, if I can unlock and mobilize assets to be unbounded by traditional settlement, sort of these exogenous batch processing, cutoff time settlement systems, and give market participants access to be able to use their assets to generate liquidity and capital efficiency around the globe, that has a much more solid, stable, systemic effect on the stability of global financial market operating activities. There is also operating efficiency. I think when most people got into blockchain and most initiatives that we work with, there was a level of focus on the operating efficiency and sort of eking out those manual processes that are still really defined in the post-trade space. Many of the efficiency, the market advancements that we can reflect on for the last 2 or 3 decades were largely around the pre-trade and the trade, the execution, efficiency, and the creation of new products and services, and left to sort of the sneaker brigade or the legions of people to deal with it from a post-trade perspective. There was a recent report that was done by the Value Exchange and DTCC, Christian's organization from the last panel, on corporate actions, which I realize might be, as exciting as mud in terms of activities in the post-trade space, but is one area of the post-trade market that is just highly inefficient. And what that study showed is that an average single U.S. corporate action had 1.1 million interactions with it across the industry. There were 1.1 instances of that corporate action needing some form of intervention or action on it. And when you extrapolate that into the 600 or 1,000 or so U.S. corporate actions that occur per annum in the year, that meant that there was about 400 billion worth of cost associated with it, 160 billion of which was deemed to be duplicative, unnecessary, manual activities. And so, I think about what Commissioner Crenshaw gave us as sort of a warning system, but what Commissioner Peirce gave us as a challenge to pursue those opportunities. It goes back to thinking about, and for all that we're all talking about here, it goes back to thinking about the issuer and the investor. And ultimately, can the issuer get access to debt and equity capital markets for their organization in a more efficient, more real-time, longer, more global way, in a way that's public and can access more investors into their organization? And can you run the time frame and the activities between issuance and investing in a way that returns more of that yield, whatever the market will bear, to the ultimate investor? And so when I think about corporate actions and the work that DTCC and Value Exchange did, who wouldn't want that 160 billion to be taken of waste, taken out of the market and returned ultimately to the investors? So I think it's good and sobering to think of every new technology, every change in operating system to be one that should be taken with humility and reverence for the rule books that exist and the decades of regulation and the decades of market activity that have gotten us to a different point, and to be aware of those risks, but to not let that prevent the pursuit of transformation and the opportunity to eke out waste and inaction and inefficiency so that you ultimately can get to a better and more efficiently operating capital markets for the issuers, and an opportunity for the taking on that risk to be returned more to an investor. And those are what we see in the real world projects that are existing from a production implementation now for our technology.
Perfect, and that was a perfect segue, I'm sorry, Johan, in talking about the sandbox that Commissioner Peirce talked about last week in her speech. So you can give some thoughts about what your impressions were and generally how you think of that type of approach to getting to the benefits of tokenization while also balancing against potential risks.
Yeah, absolutely. And we welcome the proposal for a sandbox environment, which will actually provide the firms with the ability to tokenize securities on a level playing field. And I think this level playing field definition is important because we see a lot more participants in the market starting to create some kind of tokenized securities. And I think it's going to be important at some point that we are all acting under the same rule. Overall, we support market integrity rules, and we really welcome the SEC to act quickly to move from the sandbox to an actual durable regulatory framework that will provide the regulatory certainty that we all need to participate in the space. But I think instead of adopting a formal regulatory sandbox structure, it might make sense to organically create a sandbox by providing targeted, market-wide exemptive relief, aiming at alleviating the pain points that are preventing tokenization from taking flight. I think if you look at other sandboxes that have been created in Europe, for example, the DLT program has never really taken off because of many limitations in place and the number of participants that could come in, the amount that they could actually trade on it, and other limitations really prevented the program to become this real A/B testing that we were looking for when it was announced. And so we think that such relief might address, custody requirements under the customer protection rule, whether the digital asset can be allowable asset and required haircuts under the net capital rule, and things like this. The other aspect that we think is important with the sandbox is that it's going to encourage market participants to experiment and take risk, the risks that are necessary for the tokenization of securities to become a reality. But we overall think that any exemptive relief should be conditioned on compliance with requirements aimed at investor protection, things like anti-fraud, anti-manipulation disclosure, reporting requirements. If we want the sandbox to work, it has to be safe. We heard multiple worries just today, so we need to make sure that the sandbox take care of them. But overall, we think that the sandbox is a temporary measure until Congress develop a permanent legislative framework for tokenization.
Georgia?
Thank you. Yes, well, first of all, I heard I wasn't supposed to call it a sandbox, but we definitely welcome, some sort of temporary exemptive relief with respect to tokenized securities. I think one thing that I'd like to point out is just, I don't think we need a lot of exemptive relief on the 33 Act. Like, we all agree these are securities, so we've got pretty good frameworks for the disclosures and the issuance of securities. And like we've been saying, like the tokenization of them does not change their essence. But we would need to see a little relief with respect, or at least just clarity with respect to the custody and trading. And specifically when we're talking about atomically settling these trades where NMS regulations really are not fit for purpose, and even just clarity around the ATS requirements and what would be needed with respect to atomically settled transactions, and then thinking through custody on these certain exchanges. Do you want to allow omnibus? Do you want to require atomic settlement? What kind of risks and rewards do we have? Maybe, I'm a big fan of choice, so I think allowing, investors to choose the type of settlement cycle. I think Joshua mentioned settlement cycle, and I think settlement cycle is a choice. I feel like investors should be able to choose based on the risks and rewards of, T+2, T+1, T+0, whatever really suits their needs. And it's not my job to make that decision. I don't think it's the Commission's job to make that decision for investors either. So yeah, ultimately, wrapping this up, sorry, I think we are very supportive, and we just want to be clear that, again, these are securities, so we still need to treat them like securities.
Josh?
Yeah, so I think we could spend a lot of time debating the measure of catastrophe associated with certain blockchain failures. I think that is pretty generous, but we've seen very consistent performance across major blockchains for a number of years. The fact that BlackRock and Apollo and Franklin Templeton are comfortable engaging with these systems, you would expect that they don't just kind of like make those decisions haphazardly. And from our perspective, we have spent a lot of time thinking about how these systems are actually built to be very robust, right? So there are updates to blockchains, but they happen in coordination across disparate participants, not centralized actors. And that changes things, right? Because you don't have one entity controlled by one group of people making changes that aren't in the public eye. And so I think like that is really important to keep in mind. Now the question is, how do you, so we could debate that. I think the reality of the circumstance is that even if all due respect to being in the SEC right now, thank you for having me, the SEC is not going to be capable of regulating blockchain validators as intermediaries, even if they wanted to. It's global technology. It's not going to happen. But the question is, so what can you do? Well, what you can do is, particularly with respect to tokenized securities, right, which is squarely within the Commission's purview, is you can regulate the intermediaries that want to engage. So you're talking about transfer agents and broker-dealers, right? What you can do is you can put requirements on transfer agents and broker-dealers to get informed consent from their clients around trading digital assets in public blockchains. They can have some type of kind of diligence requirement that requires them to understand the structural components of the public blockchains that they engage with and work in. Right? You can give market participants the opportunity to have choice to determine whether they want to engage with a new technology. Right? In the grand scheme of things, Kelly was throwing around some really massive numbers. Which is amazing. Those are too big for my brain because my industry is a $3 trillion industry, not like a $250 trillion industry, right? But in the grand scheme of things, these ecosystems are not going to be systemically risky to the rest of the financial ecosystem, but they do provide opportunities for market participants to engage with technology and take advantage of the technological advancements to do new things that the systems provide. You can enable transfer agents to, you can free them up to use the programmability of the technology to ease the burden of some of the record keeping requirements and some of the custody requirements, again, around tokenized securities, right? Tokenized securities are not bare assets. They're permissioned, right? The transfer agent, or maybe I like tokenization agent as well, they can provide the top layer infrastructure that enables issuing permission securities even in permissionless ecosystems. And so those are things that the commission can engage with, that we can create sandboxes, sorry, I forget what we're supposed to call it, but sandboxes around, right, that enable participants who are technologically capable and interested in engaging in this ecosystem to do in a way that is relatively safe. Every technology has failure modes. Every technology is imperfect and in a state of growth and kind of improvement over time. And so we could debate about what the margins are for blockchain systems, but I think what's more helpful is providing ways to engage that enable us to continue to grow with this technology.
Thank you. So we have about 5 minutes left. So my final question, and this was brought on both by the dialogue we had here and what I saw earlier. So it seems to me you have folks with very different views about how to move forward based on their industries, whether they come from TradFi or Disruptor, whether they're academic, et cetera. And so, if the goal is finding a way out of here, I'd like a few people to comment on, from the SEC's perspective, if you're getting input that's totally different, right? We can have this roundtable we were here for a couple of hours, but I think that discussion probably could have went on for probably 8 more hours, right? So what's the most efficient way for the SEC to get the varied feedback and have that debate so that it has it in mind as it's trying to move forward? Angela will start.
I've been thinking about this for a while as well, and it's true, we have very different perspectives on things, and one of the things that has most concerned me about the discussion and the process of thinking through what regulation should be and whether there should be regulation at all has been, a disagreement based on the facts, right? Like, there is a fundamental disagreement about what the facts about the technology are, which is so weird to me that we're here and we still are disagreeing about the facts. But as far as a way to move forward, I've suggested this since 2020, 2021. It sounds really corny, but because this is such a hard issue and it is potentially extremely consequential, the more that I guess crypto assets themselves are being used, but also the movement potentially of much of our financial system onto a new financial market infrastructure of public blockchains. Something like a Manhattan Project where we all hole up in a room for several months and actually get people from all perspectives in there, the industry builders, critics, academics, scientists, economists, and I want to be there too, and hash it out in a productive way, ideally.
Gene?
So I think one of the important things to note is that not all of these technologies are implemented the same. A lot of the risks people are talking about are very particularly Ethereum risks, which is kind of a Generation 2 blockchain. And I think the key point, the thing I think the SEC should keep in mind is who's the man behind the curtain. Because a lot of these technologies proclaim that they are decentralized, and the running joke is Dino, decentralized in name only. But when it is truly decentralized, when there truly is no single party and everyone understands how that process works, I mean, if you want to hear scary technology upgrade things, let me tell you about SSL. So, I think that the regulatory regime, and I will echo something from the earlier comment panel, interoperability, yes, between traditional and blockchain. Interoperability between blockchains is actually an unsolved mathematical problem. So when you actually sit down with cryptographers, there's hope that things like zero-knowledge proofs might work here. But I don't know that there's a way that you can bridge a securitized, a token security from one blockchain to another without a license from the SEC of some sort. So, it's an interesting and problematic item that we need to think about, who has that control, who is the man behind the curtain. I think that's the guiding light for where there should be regulation and where there maybe not should be regulation.
Kelly.
Yep, actually, I agree with Jean's point. When I think about what, this is an awesome opportunity, but with that comes an awesome responsibility. And I think the best thing that the SEC and other supervisory authorities around the globe can give to those of us in the industry is a set of principles. So it's a set of principles that have to be incorporated into solutions or into the design of the technology itself. And a couple that I'd offer that we take with great seriousness and great humility at Digital Asset are, yes, public. If I had said, all of you, good news, we're all going to get in a room together here and form an ecosystem, but first what you have to do is, that would be great, and we'd all have a good public market, but first what you have to do is take all your IRA statements and your brokerage reports, and we're going to post them on the wall, and everybody gets to see everything, and there's a group of people sitting in that room over there. You won't know who they are, but they're going to be the validators who will decide what you can actually buy and sell. I mean, it would be laughable, right? So it's equally laughable to assume that that type of evolution of technology or product or asset in the securities markets for this market and for the markets around the globe is the right way to go. So I think it's about getting to a set of principles that can be reflected. Public, yes, but privacy and permission is critically important. The financial markets rely on it, and it must be consistent in any solutions that go forward.
Well, that was a high and productive way to end it, so I'll end it there. So thank you so much to all my fabulous panelists. This was a very lively discussion, so thank you so much for your engagement.
This is a bit of a Manhattan Project Light, Project Light over here, these roundtables. We've been trying to gather different voices, and unfortunately, we can't kidnap you for months at a time, but if I could, I would love to do that. So thank you again to our panelists, and thank you, Tiffany. You did a wonderful job moderating. Applause, again, come on. So I really appreciated the conversation around risk on this panel, both the commentary on the risks that we may not be fully considering and the mitigating factors that can reduce those risks. For most of my career, I've worked closely with prospectus disclosures, and in every prospectus I have ever written or reviewed, there are pages of risks. What this illustrates is that the goal of financial regulation is not to get to zero risk. In fact, it would be a bit reckless to create a regulatory framework where the price of entry is a demonstration of zero risk. The benefit of conversations like these are they help us understand risks so we can create regulatory frameworks that are consistent with our agency's mandate and statutorily appropriate consideration of risk. The benefits of ideas like a regulatory sandbox are they help us pressure test frameworks so that we don't go from children playing on a bridge to a Mack truck driving on it. This conversation has given me a lot to think about, and I hope we can have continued engagement from the panelists and the public on some of the great points that were brought up today. Please provide any feedback you have on the Crypto Task Force webpage. I will pitch it every single time I'm at this mic. We have a great written input web form where you can provide any analysis that you've done or any thoughts that you have. And we hope that you'll join us for our final panel or our final roundtable on DeFi and the American Spirit on June 9th here to end our spring sprint towards crypto clarity. I think we're basically there. So one more roundtable is going to do it, and we'll be done. So thank you all very much, and have a great rest of your evening.